Hi, can I have your attention? I wanted to let you know we are now live streaming with audio. Thank you.
Particularly for Okay, we're now getting started on our third leg of this marathon that Sarah has put in place here today. Appreciate continuing to be with us. Representative King, we certainly appreciate you being with us lunch today, and appreciate you being here. Appreciate all your good work for education.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Okay, we have the agenda. We'll plan to follow this. First item on the agenda is the strategic plan overview from the department. Again, they're all fired up, ready to go.
Good afternoon. It's great to take this opportunity to share a bit about our initial overview of the strategic plan from the Department of Education. I'm glad to know we've had a marathon. I would expect nothing less from Sarah Hayburn, so I'm glad to know that you enjoyed the morning. What I would like to do is to walk through some slides, they're very brief, to describe where we're heading in terms of goals for the Department of Education, as well as what we're thinking about as we go forward with our strategic plan. We're in a strategic planning process that began not long after I got here, although the department had already done a lot of work on some visioning for it well before I arrived. And then we have done some things to work through 5 priority areas that you'll hear about today. And on Monday, we'll actually be hearing from some action teams within the department around very specific actionable items underneath the 5 priorities. And then we will use that from an executive leadership team perspective to design the strategic plan over the next several weeks. We will put it out for some comments from a variety of groups before it becomes final. And we would love for the State Board of Education to also weigh in on that. And so you'll be one of the groups we'll be sending it to. I did want to say before I start that we have a new member of the Department of Education who is here today. Her name is Dr. Vicki Kirk, if she would stand. Vicki is 4th day in, I believe, day 4, and she will be serving as a new Deputy Commissioner, a CAO, a Chief Academic Officer for the department. She has a lot of responsibility, a lot of departments under her, and so we're thrilled that she has joined the Department of Ed. So thank you, Vicki, for being here. Let me first share a bit about where we've been. And I know some of you know this vividly because you've been part of this board and part of this story for the last several years. But Tennessee is the fastest improving state in the nation on NAEP. We just had a conversation about NAEP and you serving on the NAEP board. It is a very important metric for us, and we're proud as a state that we continue to have the mantra that we've been the fastest improving state in the nation on both math and ELA in 4th and 8th grade. We also have the fastest growing graduation rate of any state in the nation. I had an opportunity to be on a webinar call the other day, and this was pointed out on the call, and so we can also be very proud that nationally we're known for improving our graduation rate. We've had consistent gains on TCAP. Our tests here in Tennessee are standardized tests every year since the new assessment in 2010 under the American Diploma Project, which became the Tennessee Diploma Project standards in our state. We also have improved our ACT statewide average from a 19 to a 19.3, and you will see that we will continue to have improvement there as a goal because we still lag behind some other states in terms of our statewide average. At the same time we're making these improvements, we continue to have a changing world around us. We have to do a lot more to make sure that our students succeed. I've made that statement to a group of coaches that go in and actually work with teachers in the classroom. And one of the people in the room raised her hand and she said, "I don't think we can do any more." And I appreciate you saying that, because what I want to clarify is when I say more, that means we be more efficient and effective with what we're currently doing and look for ways to get to the end result potentially differently than we have today. And so more means not necessarily stacking things on top of each other, but concentrating on the most important things and taking off and abandoning things that do not work. So by 2025, we know that 55% of all new jobs will require some kind of post-secondary education. You've heard of Drive to 55 in Tennessee. We want to make sure that in education, in K-12 education, we're part of that story, that we ensure that we are preparing more students for post-secondary so they can access the jobs in Tennessee. In addition, post-secondary graduates are more likely to be employed. That's true. They're more likely to be employed, you know that, and to have higher earnings than high school graduates. So this is an important goal for us to continue to push students to post-secondary. When I say post-secondary, I want to indicate what that means. It is moving students to some kind of credential. That could be a 4-year degree, and we want to move more students to 4-year degree. It could mean a 2-year degree. It could mean some type of certificate. It could be a credential that actually takes less than 2 years. But regardless, credentials are going to help move students to connect to the jobs that exist. We do have a reality in Tennessee that I want to make sure we're aware of. Less than half of all 3rd grade students are proficient or above in reading. Less than half of all 8th grade students are proficient or above in reading. Less than 40% of all high school students in Tennessee are proficient or above in English 3. Numeracy is slightly higher than 50% are math scores, but we still are struggling across the state in both, but in particular in reading. So I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. By the last data that has been published in fall 2013, almost 64% of our first-time freshmen in Tennessee community colleges took at least one remedial or developmental course. So we're still struggling in this area. We believe that we will have improvements based on what we know we're doing with Tennessee Promise, but this is a reality check for us as well. And finally, even though we're fastest improving, we still rank in the bottom half of all states on NAEP or the nation's report card. So this continues to be an area where we need to not only be the fastest improving, we need to make a goal to quickly move to the top half of all states, because this is where many businesses look to make decisions about, does that state have an educated workforce where we can move our companies, our businesses. We do believe that Tennessee Promise, let's click here, Tennessee Promise is giving us a new opportunity. We now have grades 13 and 14 available to us free of charge to our high school students who graduate. We're looking forward to connecting better from a K-12 perspective with what can happen through Tennessee Promise to make sure we are working on that transition and that we actually have students incredibly prepared for what the expectations will be at the community college and beyond. I want to share with you a slide that shows why that is important. By our own data in Tennessee, our P20 database, we looked at two cohorts of students, the 2007 high school freshman cohort and the 2008 high school freshman cohort. The numbers are very similar, so I'm just going to show you the 2007 cohort. We had almost 73,000 students in that high school cohort in Tennessee. About 10,500 or so students did not graduate from high school on time. Okay, so that was based on on-time graduation. About 22,000 of those students graduated from high school and entered the workforce directly. So they graduated, went into the workforce in Tennessee. Of those students, they are making around $9,000 in an annual salary. Those that did not get a credential of some kind, they did not go on to a post-secondary experience. Now, what we can't track is students who went out of state. So these are students who stayed in Tennessee and are working. We know that this $9,000 or so, and by the way, it's $9,050 for the 2008 cohort, so a very similar number, is taking into account a lot of students who are not making minimum wage and are working part-time. If they are working full-time and you take the part-time students out, this number jumps to about $18,000 annually, which isn't much better. Yes, you can support yourself at that full-time rate, but it's going to be really hard to support a family and to be a contributing member to that community long-term. So we believe these numbers show the importance of ensuring that our students are moving on into post-secondary. Now, the other reality check is that we did have students go on to post-secondary. We had around 40,000 students enrolled. This could be, again, in any of the programs I've described. 42% of them were not enrolled after the first year. 58 were enrolled, 42% were not. So that means we have gotten them there, but we haven't kept them there. There could be a variety of reasons why they're not staying. We could speculate, I'm sure in this room, probably 10 or 12 of those. What we do know is some of this is about preparation. They weren't prepared for what they were facing when they got to the post-secondary program. There are lots of other reasons, but K-12 preparation matters. And so we have to do a better job preparing our students for what post-secondary looks like. So because we have this moment in time, we have momentum as a state, we have made improvements, but there is still a gap of where we've come to and where we need to go. That gap is being filled by lots of things. We believe Tennessee Promise is one way to fill that gap. The way we've raised standards in Tennessee will be another way that we will close that gap. The way we're connecting what we're doing in K-12 to post-secondary more intentionally will help close that gap. But what we have to do is stay focused on success after graduation. We have had as a goal for many years in Tennessee that we got students to graduate, right? You got to get them to graduate. I was in a school the other day in one of our rural counties, and when I was having a conversation with one of the teachers, what she kept saying to me was trying to make sure those students got those credits. That's not our story anymore. They have to have those credits, by the way, and they have to graduate. And we're doing a better job of that. But it's also the story about what happens to them after they graduate. Are we preparing them not just to check a box and get a credit and move on to the next thing? Are we preparing them for the reality of what they'll face when they graduate? That not only means they need competence in something academic, something that actually contributes to their work from an academic or content perspective, it also means they have the soft skills, the emotional intelligence, the work ethic, the responsibility, and the grit to do the work they're going to be asked to do. We know that that is something that it takes a village, truly, a community, families working with our schools to ensure that we can get to the success that we need after graduation. So we're reorganizing around this new vision. It's not about the floor, which is graduation. It's about that's expected. And we've got to go beyond that to make sure they're ready for what happens afterwards. We have 4 goals that we believe that we can accomplish over the next several years. And these are bold goals. Okay, we could come here and say, oh, well, we think this is going to happen. We have plans that we know this can happen if we stay organized around our priorities and stay focused on high expectations around these priorities. First, we believe Tennessee will continue to be the fastest improving state in the nation on NAEP. We will know some pretty immediate information on this in the fall. We will have new NAEP results, so this is the next 2 years, and we hope that it will give us confidence in this goal. We believe this can happen, and we believe if we stay on that pathway that we can rank from the bottom to the top half of all states in 4th and 8th grade NAEP by 2019. Secondly, we believe that Tennessee high school seniors will improve faster than any other state. This would be measured again by the NAEP and in other methods that we're talking about. But in general, we could be the fastest improving state on 12th grade NAEP by 2017. We believe that we can move the average ACT score in the state from 19.3 to a 21, so that would allow more students to get a Hope Scholarship. And we believe that is possible by 2020. And finally, we have to organize around our Tennessee Promise and our Drive to 55 goal, which would be to move a majority of our high school graduates to post-secondary, not a minority of our high school students to post-secondary as we currently sit. Most of them need to be moving on into a post-secondary opportunity. And we believe that is possible as we meet our 2025 goals. To achieve this success, briefly, we're going to reorganize our work around 5 priorities. The star represents the 5 that you'll hear about from me very briefly because we will be digging into more of these to share with you at our next board meeting. 1, we know early foundations matters. What we do from kindergarten to 3rd grade and even before. We know that supporting educators better to do the work that we have in front of us is extraordinarily important, and using our feedback and data in a way that supports them to do the work we've asked them to do. All means all. We will not give up on every single student. Every student needs to grow and be successful. Empowering districts. Districts need to be empowered with real data, real information, where they can take back and make decisions, because we have a very diverse state and diverse needs across our districts. And finally, we know our high school strategies and that bridge to post-secondary matters, and to do more with what we have in high school. Early foundations will be a focus on kindergarten through 2nd grade reading, so we can ensure that by the end of 3rd grade that we have all students in Tennessee reading on grade level. This is a massive goal. We have schools right now, one that I was in recently, that have less than 20% of their students reading on grade level by 3rd grade. These are real schools in our state. So this is not a small goal. It's easy to say, we're going to have all kids reading on grade level by 3rd grade. That sounds easy. It's very challenging, but it's the right work to organize around. We know that if students are not reading on grade level by the end of 3rd grade, we have set them up for failure. They continue to fail year after year as the content gets harder, and they do not have the confidence or the skill set to do the work. We also know that we're spending a great deal of money, federal and state money, in pre-K. We know that early foundations matter, but we have to make sure our voluntary pre-K programs are high quality, so that when students are going on to kindergarten, we see success that lasts after 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, because the quality of the pre-K program they have that focused on literacy and numeracy skills as well as emotional skills and social skills are the best quality we can have. And we will do more with some data around this to monitor this better to help our pre-K programs improve. And also, kindergarten is extraordinarily important. And we know that kindergarten through 2nd grade is somewhere that we probably don't have great data. We don't have data that we can share on a regular basis that says this is what works and this is what doesn't. And so doing more here to give our districts better information about what's working and what's not. In supporting educators, our teachers have now, and you're going to hear more about our teacher evaluation report soon, they have better information than they ever have around very specific items off of the rubric around where they may need to improve. Now, we have to use that to better support teachers for improvement. So when you know that you struggle with questioning, what are we doing to ensure that you're improving, and how can we best support that work? We've got to have effective tools to get you there. Also, student attendance and other non-academic factors impact what you do as a classroom teacher and if a student is learning. If the student's not there, the student is not learning what you've prepared. So we will do a better job with our early warning systems of getting information to schools about students that are actually high need, and then work diligently with the districts to support those students and families that are the highest need. Data around this will be extraordinarily important in making sure that we meet these goals. Quickly, all means all. In our state, around 55% of our students are economically disadvantaged. That means over half. These are students who are qualifying for free and reduced lunch across the state. If that's the case, then we know we can't meet these goals unless we're talking about every single student, and we're closing the gap between our subgroups. While we have made massive strides with our economically disadvantaged students, our African American students in particular, we still have major gaps. And these are going to be where we either meet our goal or we don't. So our work with response to intervention will continue to get better and ramp up. We know where it's being implemented well. The feedback from our teachers and from our districts is this is one of the best things we've ever done. And we've got to support where it's not going well to make sure we meet these goals. We also need to have a strategy around working with our English language learners, and that will be part of our strategic plan. A strategy that can be used particularly in our urban centers and some of our rural counties who have a growing EL population. We still have too many students in schools that are not performing at the level they need to. Again, just in a school with kids that aren't reading on grade level. Massive numbers. To support them, we will continue with the strategies we've had with our Achievement School District and supporting I-zones across the state, but we will be looking for other ways the state can support schools that are on our priority and focus list in ways that we've not been able to in the past. So we want all schools to have support, and we will look for ways to do that. Empowering districts. As I said, districts are different in size, demographics, and needs. So we have got to be in a position where we provide districts with great information to help personalize their work for the needs of their students. Instead of having something that everyone actually has to submit to, we can have options that make sense for the different districts across our vast and interesting state. I know I can go to a district right next door to another one, and the type of students and needs they have vary dramatically. So we want districts to have more flexibility to make decisions on their own. Also, districts that are showing great growth, great improvement, great achievement with their students, we want them to have more of autonomy to do the things that they can do to innovate and to help teach the rest of us ways that we can improve. We will also continue to support differentiated pay, different types of retention and promotion for teachers, and to think about leadership pipelines and career trajectories for our teachers to make sure teachers understand the pathways they have in their profession, and to support that so we keep our very best teachers in the field. And finally, high school. Unfortunately, we have data in 8th grade that actually is a great predictor of what happens in 12th grade. By our own data, many of the students that sit as at risk in 8th grade are the exact same students that are at risk at 12th grade and don't graduate. So we've got to use our data better from the 8th grade perspective to make changes to what we do with that child during high school to make sure it's not the same story that they were under in 8th, but it's changed and it's improved. We also can use that data to better understand what we need to do differently in high school to engage students. Again, in traveling across the state, I've seen multiple high schools on the same day in neighboring districts. And what I may see in one high school is dramatically different than what I will see in the other. In terms of engagement, kids in internships and externships, or kids sitting in the classroom, bored to tears and telling me that. when I ask them. Now, that doesn't take a visit to know that. You know that because you've been in school. We've got to do a better job of talking about what should high school look like to engage kids in what the workplace needs, to motivate them, and to see what the possibilities are. Finally, this handoff between high school and post-secondary is weak. There's a transition that we believe some of our mentors with Tennessee Promise will help with, and actually are giving feedback on what we might do differently. When I'm talking to folks who have mentors who dropped out, mentees who dropped out, they've said, there were some things we could do differently, and we're going to take that information and make changes as we should over the next few years, but also to ensure that our school counselors and our teachers and our principals have the skill set they need to make this handoff smoother with post-secondary. I would say in closing that teams that are working on these priorities are fabulous. I'm looking forward to our presentations on Monday. They will be presenting in teams to our senior leadership team in the department. And we will spend a good portion of the day talking about the very specific ways we can meet these goals, as well as the strategies that will take us over the next 3 to 4 years. And also how we can engage more partners and be more collaborative in the work that we have to do. I've said this to many groups, and I would say this to you in closing. This is not something that a Commissioner of Education, the Executive Director of the State Board, 2, 3 Deputy Commissioners, the State Department of Education can do in isolation. To get to the next level of where we need to go, it's going to take everybody working as a community on these very important goals. We can't leave students behind. We have to have students reading. We have to have more students going on to post-secondary. And that's not something that one policy change will do. And so I want to say to you, we elicit your help, people in this room and anyone who's listening, because as a team, we can meet these goals. And we know they're possible. We've got to stay forward, can't go backwards, and we have to look even more effectively and efficiently at the work that we're doing. So with that, I'll open it up if there are any questions that the State Board members may want to ask.
A question for Candace? Question? Good. Presentation. So Sarah has a question.
Well, I want to go back to some of the post-secondary data that you shared with us. I think to me some of that data is the most sobering I've seen in a while, and I think there's sort of competing narratives that we are telling ourselves right now about the progress that we've made real and quantifiable and reasons for celebration, and yet the reality that we're seeing in terms of the results of our graduating students still paints a very different picture in terms of life outcomes and the reality of student space. And I just think, again, something that we can think about together, how do we share this data more widely? Because I think this is a real call to arms in terms of how we think about the urgency still that we have behind this work.
I appreciate the question, and we are certainly trying to share this data with groups that we're meeting with, whether it's me or other folks in the department who go out and speak to groups. We also have Mike Krause through the governor's office actually using this very slide and a few others from the P20 data to share with folks who are thinking about post-secondary. So the governor's office is using this as well. We would love for you to help share that story through all the avenues that you have, whether that's presenting, media, writing editorials, because this is a real story, and it's a story that I'm not sure that every area across the state understands. We are going to be doing some work within our strategy to make sure areas that are across the state know what they have to do to get certain jobs, and that needs to be in the hands of everybody. A parent, a teacher, a school counselor, a principal, community members, because there may be a gap in understanding what you need to do and then having the motivation and the work opportunities early to see what those jobs look like. And I think we're assuming we may be doing a lot of that, and we are in pockets, but we could do it much better statewide. So I appreciate that question.
Yes.
It seems like we've decided third grade, being able to read by third grade is vital. 8th grade, we can predict what you'll be doing in the 12th grade. You know, as a father of 4, I had 3 National Honor Society, great athletes, life comes easy, and then there's your baby. You know, he made me wonder whether high school graduation was really going to happen. But my wife and I probably had the largest argument we ever had about spending about $5,000 to send him to Sylvan. Because although he had been homeschooled and Christian schooled and public schooled at different points of the life, there were gaps in this child's education for whatever reason. Now, Sylvan did not, and I'm not promoting Sylvan, okay? Nothing what they do is particularly proprietary, and we can get the same materials and do it at a public school level or whatever, but they didn't go back and teach him the 7th grade. They only taught him where he was missing gaps. And so within about 7 months, you took a child who, although physically was in the 7th grade, was functioning on a 4th grade level and brought him up. And now he's the outstanding freshman in his college at the University of Tennessee, which I didn't think he was going to college. But it seems like we need to spend money and time making sure that before you pass out of 3rd grade, that one, you can read on grade level. And then if you're in the 8th grade, we need to make sure you're ready to go to high school. And if you're missing some kind of skill set, have some kind of remedial program in the 8th grade to make sure that you're successful in high school. So we get these numbers up on this slide. But I don't know how we do that.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment, too, because you've reiterated the importance of the early skills. We know that when we see gaps through RTI at high school, that many of these things that they're missing are skills that they should have learned back in kindergarten through 4th grade. So they're not what you think of, it's the stuff down here. And when I worked with some reading intervention, when I was working with high school kids that did not have, they weren't reading on grade level and there was something missing, it was usually something phonemic that they didn't get early on or some vocabulary instruction that was missing very early on. And then it just continued to decrease, right? They continued to improve and decreased without some kind of expert knowledge to help.
Right, like he understood fractions, but he didn't understand how to multiply and divide fractions.
Right.
Well, rather than go back and teach the entire 7th grade math program, their diagnostic said, this is what this child needs to focus on. They focused on multiplication because you can't do algebra without multiplication and division of fractions. So it just, and I told my wife, I said, if we don't spend the money now, he will be frustrated at 15. He's going to drop out of school or get his girlfriend pregnant or some other, be in prison at 20. She tells me I'm a little overly dramatic. But, boys who don't thrive get frustrated. And I would say if you look demographically at this group that didn't graduate, you'd probably see a 70-30 split as opposed to the 50-50 you would normally think. Because I think you have a lot of boys out there that are just frustrated, and we didn't get interdiction into their life early enough. And that's what I'm saying, it just seems like we need to make sure before you go into high school, before you pass out of the 8th grade, that there is some kind of a standard, because it just sets just an entire trajectory that you succeed or you fail.
Yeah, and based on your illustration, which is a personal one, I know, but it makes a larger point. The importance of early foundations can't be overlooked, right? So we have to focus on that, and we've got some interesting ideas on how to do that, and to some of your points, and you're going to be hearing more of that. But I would add to it that we also have to be extraordinarily careful about how we engage kids in the joy of what they do and how they learn early on. So it's the science of reading and the joy of reading, the art that you put together. And teacher preparation is certainly an area that I'm passionate about. We can do a better job as a state in preparing on both of those, particularly in literacy, the science of reading and the interventions that you need to know how to do when kids are at different places, and how do you inspire the joy and love of reading at the same time. And a lot of it is confidence comes from demonstrated ability. So when kids read, they are joyous about it, and that spirals. And so that scientific understanding of reading will be a key part. The department's already done some work in that. We're going to build on that and continue moving that forward. So really excellent point.
Yeah, we need this.
I just have some questions on this data. So the 40,235 enrolled, are those just in Tennessee schools, or are those, I guess mathematically they must be wherever they went, right?
Correct.
So then the 3,500 who completed a certificate or a degree, what's the data on the other 37,000? Well, on the other, I wasn't a math major, on the other 17,000 who had the 58%. So you have 58% are still there in a year.
Right.
And then in 3 years, you have this 3,500 number. Where are the other 17,000?
So those are the students who So these are the 58% were still enrolled. We would assume.
In 1 year.
That's correct.
But in 3 years, when you have this next data point, where are those others still enrolled, or do we have a percentage that are now no longer enrolled after 3 years? I'm just curious if there's another drop.
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure our database actually can follow that, but I can certainly ask the question and follow up. But I know from this data, we also worked with our TBR, our labor department data, so we were using multiple databases, so I'll see if we have that pinpointed data. Great question.
The reason, I mean, if it's after 1 year, obviously your high school preparation concerns, but if it's after if they last 3 years and then are still not able to get degrees, you have other concerns.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll send you that if we have it.
Commissioner, conversation we've had before, going back to your slide, all mean all.
Right.
The great disconnect in many inner city neighborhoods about the role of ASD. Shelby County, we have the I-zone situation.
Right.
How do we bridge this great disconnect about what ASD should be doing? And these communities that have no idea that there are low-performing schools that their kids are going to. And so all of a sudden we come in and we say, oh, guess what? You're at the bottom 5%. And they look at you and say, but my child came home with an A or B, and now you're telling me someone is going to take over my school. This is a huge issue in our community. You and I passed this discussion.
Absolutely. And we'll continue to have that conversation,
Yes,
I know. I would say to that we've got to do a better job communicating generally what all of these things mean, right? So when you say you're in the bottom 5%, we actually need to communicate better what that actually means. Someone says, well, no, I'm not in a failing school. I've had X, Y, and Z. So how are we defining that? What does that actually mean in terms of data? And what does that mean for the pathway your students on? Because that's real. It's not, the school's not necessarily the failing school. It's what's happening to those students if they stay on this pathway, right? But those numbers tell a story. They tell you about the pathway that the student's going to be on if we don't intervene. And that's why the strategies of I-zone and ASD allow for some intervention to change the story of the students in that school, to hopefully intervene and put them in a situation where they're not on that same failing pathway that they're going to be on. So we've got to do a better job telling that story and communicating what it actually means and defining those words. I would also say we could do a better job of really communicating earlier about what are the schools that are on that pathway that community needs to be more concerned about, because this is an intervention that might be coming if change doesn't occur back here. We think now there's been enough information now. I mean, 2 priority lists have been run through the state that we've got some really good information now very early on that schools do know, if they've been on the priority list twice, that there are some issues there that the state will most likely have to intervene at some level, or the district's going to intervene through the I-zone. And so communicating that better is something that is on our list of communication strategies. We have a new communications director, and we've talked about a better way to communicate what the purposes of the ASD, what the purposes are of I-zone, and how we're working with districts, even in a better way going forward, to make decisions together.
Yeah, because we have testimony in the House that sometimes our principals didn't know that somehow they were in the lowest 5%. And, of course, the recommendation was it needs to be put on the board's website, the list of schools and their priority, so that there's no mystery somehow that, because it'll get around pretty quick if you're in the bottom 5% or 10%. But, you know, I'm not sure how you end up. It seemed to be the testimony was that the LEA or the ASD was told this is a failing school, but somehow they're not communicating this to the principal, and I really find that kind of hard to believe.
So the lists are public. There's nobody like sitting in the department hiding the list. So the lists are public, but there could be, I don't know the specific principle or the situation, but there could be that somehow that information didn't get to that person based on the communication channels, but they are public. And so we've heard that. So we'll do a better job of, what we don't want to do is have it in the paper every single day either, because folks don't want that. So how do you have that happy medium of making sure everybody who needs to know knows, and also that we're making decisions that were communicated very well early on, and so there's not a gotcha or a what happens after the fact. So we've heard that as well, and I'm new, and so I'm trying to look into that and see are there ways that we could communicate it differently that would make sure that we don't have those kinds of
well, and even getting house members to understand that if you have an LEA or an AFD take over a school and they were in the bottom 5%, when you get rid of that bottom 5%, guess what there is? There's a new bottom 5%, and they seem to get frustrated with this. It's like, well, there's always going to be we took a school that was failing, we've turned it around, and we've made it, an I-zone or an AFD, we've done something with it. So there will be schools that will come down, and so the schools who are coming down need to know, okay, we're at the bottom. We weren't last year, but now we are. Now we're going to have to up our ante to stay viable. So
yeah, and let me say something to that, and then I know I'm probably way over time, Sarah. But let me say to that even schools that are in the bottom 15%, we would say aren't where they need to be, right? So moving that bottom, just like we would move the bottom with standards, raise expectations, and you have a new minimum, and now how graduation is sort of a new minimum, these things are going to happen over time because you have new expectations in the workplace. You have new expectations of what it means to be prepared for what the expectations are in the field. And so as that happens, we hope we're moving all ships up, right? Everybody's rising on their wave. And that over time, we will have schools that the bottom is really not the bottom anymore. It's in the top 50%. We're just not close to that now as a state. And
we try to describe it that, there's schools that are like in a block of A schools, and there's schools that are in block of B. These are the schools that are in the F range, and they're the bottom of the F range, just to kind of get a visual out there. So it's not like you're like the bottom of the best. You're the bottom of the bottom, and just getting people to understand. But there will always be a 5%.
Mike, did you have?
Just briefly, I'm Chamber. I'm about box job creation, so that's where I'm coming from. And I think I agree with everything that you've got. I also understand the benchmarks. The only thing I would say is that in the next strategic plan, the one that, for example, that we're able to move from 19 to 21, that we need to start looking at the sub-benchmarks with science at 24, math at 22, 21, and reading. Because we're seeing people getting into college, but they're being pushed because they didn't develop a competency in math and science over into majors that unfortunately don't have any jobs attached to them. They probably got college debt. And then if they want to go like I did and major in history, then fine, knowing that I'm going to do white tape. But I think we need to move at some point to where we're getting a little more granular on what we're preparing them for. And by the way, those STEM probably plays heavier in the 2-year colleges than in the tech field that you could hire in or 4 years.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. We will note that. We have done that as well, but we are trying to look at overarching and then dig into those as we move forward. And all of it will move forward if we can get to the 21, 22, 23 average. So we can set some benchmarks as an interesting comment for some of the sub-tests or the content tests as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I would, I guess, follow on to that. I would often feel like the best measure we've got of what we're doing in K-12 is the percentage of the students that are scoring at those benchmarks on all 4 ACT tests. So I think that's an important measure. And I'm sure that we will be looking at some measures in addition to NAEP. I think NAEP is a great measure, and it's really the only thing out there where we're really compared to other states. But it only happens once every 2 years. So we've got to have some other measures in there for the interim.
Yeah, and I would say the measures that you know about already, where we measure from our 3rd through 8th grades and our EOCs and look at improvement, that will continue as a state every year, because we can see from year to year, did we actually improve in English 3 over last year? And we know that we have some issues in literacy that we're working on. Math has improved over time, and it's, you know, there's been some bumpy spots in places. We do know that we're going to have a new assessment with TN Ready. And when we move to a new assessment, I hope this group in this room in particular is prepared that there will naturally be a drop. That's what happens when you move, and it's happened before in Tennessee. So that's not unusual. As that drop happens, though, we can respond to it, and we continue to show improvement because we're moving again from the floor to a new floor. And when you do that, you're going to have a drop.
Just a couple of other comments. I can't make a few comments here. I think the slide that you had up showing the number of students that going to high school, graduate high school, and going to college and so forth is terribly important. But I think we always ought to use that slide in combination with the other slides about the progress we made. You know, if we put those two together, I think the message is pretty significant. But I think we ought not overlook some of the progress that has been made. You know, just one other comment. I really agree with the comments that were made here, that you made, and others have made about reading at grade level, on grade 3 grade level. I think that's terribly important. But I've got a daughter-in-law who is a 3rd grade teacher, and she showed me this last weekend, the social studies test that we were talking about using in 3rd grade, or looking at using in 3rd grade. And it is very rigorous. I'm a strong supporter of rigor. I wonder a little bit about whether, if we spend that much time on social studies to really be able to do that test, whether we aren't going to neglect some of the things we need to do in the basic skills like reading and math. I just think we all
May I address that too? I'll put this back on for that. In terms of the rigor of the social studies test, I want us to remember that literacy runs across all of these subject areas. So, when I was teaching reading just as much in science and social studies as I was teaching it in my English language arts reading course. And so we want to make sure our teachers are integrating reading skill sets, reading knowledge, meeting reading standards in social studies as well. I also want to note, while I have a public forum with this group, that we do have practice tests currently out that are examples of what the field test will look like for our new test in social studies that's being tested here in a few weeks. So remember, this year we have new social studies standards. So this is the first time they've been implemented. And the field test will be taken. That's no stakes. There's not an accountability attached to it, but it's allowing us to see the rigor of the different types of questions that will be out there, and will allow us to help make some best decisions about which test questions to choose going forward. So there will be on a field test, like any field test, a range of types of questions. Some we would never use, right? That's the nature of a field test. And some that are going to be the ones that got the best feedback. Those are the ones that we would use going forward. And so we're using this time period to actually get feedback from the field, from teachers that we've already heard, because they've taken the field test. They've taken the practice field test. And they're giving us feedback, and we will use that in decision-making for what the real assessment, the operational assessment, will look like next year. So please reassure her that we're taking that feedback. A field test is just that, and you're going to have a range of questions, some difficult, maybe some not as much, but we would hope that literacy is being taught across all the subject areas.
Yeah, I told her that. I'm not sure if she believes me. But thank you, Candace. Good job. Appreciate the work that you're doing, the work on the strategic plan. I think we're getting exactly on the correct side. Thank you. Okay, Paul, you're up. Revision to education licensure policy.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. And we have 3 items related to teacher and leader licensure for you this afternoon. And I'm going to bring up Dr. Amy Wooten, who heads up our licensure division and expert for this first item for teacher licensure issues. I'm going to give you the mic as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. right. So today we just wanted to provide a brief overview of some of the changes that we proposed to the licensure policy. Those of you who were on the board at the time will recall that we passed this policy last July, and since that time, we've been working hard to communicate to our stakeholders about this policy, and through that process, we got lots of feedback. We got lots of hard questions that we've had to answer, the things that we anticipated that we would have to answer and anticipated that we would need to probably clarify some things and possibly make some corrections, which you'll see that we have done that now. And we are really excited as we approach the September 1st transition from the existing licensure policy to our new licensure policy. We have, just to give you an overview, we have communicated with key stakeholders by working closely with our core executive directors. We have been able to go to many director, supervisor, and principal study councils, and we're continuing to do that. My colleague and I are going down to Memphis next week and then making a stop in Jackson on the way back, presenting to 3 different groups. So we've worked hard to make sure everybody understands the changes that are coming. In addition to that, as you also know, we are in the middle of developing a new data system that will house our licensure information as well as our evaluation data. And we anticipate that during the summer, we will be out and about training folks on how to use our new data system, which will be a key part of making this work much more efficient and streamlined for our educators, which is something we're very, very excited about. And then you see the last dot up here, of course, is our September 1st deadline. So you should have received in your packet a cover sheet that bulleted all of the changes except we missed one, which I'll make sure I point out. So instead of walking through each one of those, because some of those are very simple things, I thought that I would touch on those that are most substantive, but of course would be willing to answer any question you have about any of them. So the first one that I'd like to call your attention to is the change clarification change we've made related to the verification of content knowledge. The change that we made was to drop the 24-hour option. So in the policy that was passed in July, there were 3 ways that a candidate's content knowledge could be verified by an educator preparation provider. That was a major 24 hours in the content area or with the practice exam. When we passed the new educator preparation policy in October, that policy was where we made the shift. So that policy was where we approved major or practice. So the change here is to align the licensure policy with the preparation policy. Give a little bit more background about why we made that shift. We think it's really important to elevate the importance of content knowledge that teachers will have. And so if you're going to walk into a classroom and be responsible for teaching biology, we need to have some reassurance that you do, in fact, know that content. And through the development of the educator preparation policy, we agreed that we felt that the 24 hours just wasn't sufficient. So I'm more than willing to take questions about that, but I do want to point out
what page is that?
I'm sorry. Michael, you have mine. It's in a footnote.
Page 1.
It should be on page 1.
Okay. I just couldn't find it in the footnote.
You can't read it because it's small.
It's tiny.
Okay, I see it now.
Okay. So the challenge will be that there could be someone who comes in from out of state, for example, who we think might be a really great biology teacher, but their major was math. They're going to have to take that practice exam before we can hire them as a teacher of record. So in some cases, that could delay that person's entry into the classroom a little bit. They could, of course, come in on a permit, and they're allowed to teach as a substitute for 20 days. Most of our practice exams are given monthly. There are some that are more occasional than that, but for the most part, we think that the weight of knowing that someone has demonstrated content knowledge is what's most important and will lead to ensuring that we have effective educators in our classrooms. Two other points on this slide that I want to make sure to draw your attention to are the clarification that we've included about when renewal and advancements will take place. With few exceptions, all educators will advance or renew their license during the year immediately prior to the date of expiration of the license. So if a license is set to expire on August 31st, 2020, the first date that the educator would be eligible to advance or renew the license would be September 1st, 2019. And they'd have that entire year, and all they'll need to do is get their information to us, and then we'll be able to process that license in our brand new data system, which will make it so much faster. The exceptions to those are that if someone is on the second issuance of a practitioner license because they didn't have sufficient years of experience to advance, as soon as they have enough years of experience, they may go ahead and advance. They don't have to live out the remainder of the practitioner license. So once they meet those criteria for advancement, they'll be able to do that. The other case would be if a license has become inactive, so they've gone beyond their expiration date and they want to come back into the classroom, of course they can do that at any point in time. The last thing I'll point out on this slide before I move to the next is that we did beef up our section related to transitioning from the new structure. We realized that the way that we wrote this probably wasn't the most logical. So it should say transition to new structure for eliminated license types. So for instance, we will no longer have the interim B, the interim D, the transitional licenses. And so as you can imagine, a lot of the questions we've gotten have been from educators who are either on these licenses or anticipate being on these licenses. And so we have added more language to be more clear about what will happen to these educators. Most of them will move to a practitioner license. And the thing that is in question is whether they move to the first issuance or the second issuance of the practitioner license, and we've tried to make that very clear in the policy.
Can you tell me what page you're on in the document that we got?
20. Michael Durline is my right-hand man on all of this.
So is it the section under current educators, is that correct? On that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
All right? Okay. So the next slide is about changes and corrections. I only have two on here that I want to bring your attention to, but again, I'm more than happy to take questions about any of them. First of all, we wanted to clarify how we would handle the applications that are coming in this year and what would happen. Currently, we allow educators a grace period through December 1st.
So this is page 20 also, right?
Yes.
Okay, 20.
We allow educators a grace period. So if someone's license is set to expire this August 31st, 2015, as long as they meet the requirements by August 31st, 2015, we allow them until December 1st to get that paperwork in our office. That was an existing practice. I've been here almost exactly 3 years, and that was an existing practice before I arrived. And we felt that, at least for this year, during the transition period, we should continue to allow that grace period. So what that means is if an educator submits an application to us and they meet the requirements for a license, for example, for a transitional license, and they get those documents into us on or before December 1st, then we can issue that until December 1st, as long as they qualified for it before August 31st. After this year, that practice of a grace period will go away. And then the final thing, which actually was not on the bulleted list on your cover sheet, but was perhaps the most important thing we did to the license, and is on to the policy, was on page 4. One of the most often asked questions that we got was related to administrators who hold teaching licenses and the requirements that they would have to meet in order to renew their licenses. There were a lot of concerns about trying to do professional development related to being an administrator and do a good job with that, and also trying to accrue 60 professional development points, which would be required. So the policy allows active administrators who are working in a CASEL-mandated position. That's a position that requires that you participate in state professional development, state-mandated professional development for administrators. You're in that position in the year that the teacher license is up for renewal, that we will waive the 60 professional development points as long as you are up to date in your requirements related to your administrator license.
Can you clarify the communication structure or process for informing teachers and administrators of the changes? I've received questions directed to me.
About this one in particular, or more generally?
In general terms, when we're making a change to the licensure policy, what is the methodology for communicating?
Well, generally, we don't communicate changes before the board has approved them.
Of course.
Yes. So something like the administrator, the waiving of the 60 professional development points, we'll have multiple methods once the board has approved that, and that would be during presentation. And I will say that when we go out, and I get that question because I often get it, we will say, we intend to address this. One option would be to do something. So we would respond to the question, but we will proactively include it in presentations now. Another thing that we are building out as much as possible is our website. We're trying to make sure there's documentation for all of our policies. We have the policy there, but we're also creating what we're calling quick facts, which are 1 to 2 pagers on specific topics. And then in addition to that, we have operating procedures. Operating procedures are detailed implementation plans. A lot of times, the step-by-step part isn't in the policy, and so in operating procedures, that's where that'll appear. We know that we will use our director's update to communicate major shifts. And I'm sure that I will be working with our communications office to think about other ways to disseminate the information.
Yeah, and let me share that. The Director's Update is a weekly newsletter that goes out to all the directors of schools that have all pertinent information that we would expect them to get out to teachers. And then we have other avenues that are similar type updates from other areas, and we try to take more pertinent things like this and put it in all of them. So some would go to teachers and educator updates, some would go to other groups. So we try to put them out through our newsletter system.
The last thing I'll say about that is that we also have 2 email accounts that have been dedicated to this whole shift in licensure policy: redesign.questions@tn.gov and redesign.comments@tn.gov. And we've had lots and lots of educators email us about their individual cases, and we're happy to respond to those. Okay.
Okay.
Paul, let's get back to you.
Let me
Unless you have...
ask before you get going.
Sure.
On page 3, they're under advancement of the practitioner license to the professional license. Got 3 years of experience. The recommendation of the director is going to be an and in there.
So we hit there laughing because we actually went up and forth about how to put it in many times. It is 3 years of experience as well as either the recommendation for the documentation of 30 PPP. So the 3 years of experience is one
Should
criteria.
in that case, would the or be up?
We can add, I think the thing that we could do would be to add an and after the 3 years of it.
Yeah, that's what I was
We can do
suggesting.
and either or something like that. Because the recommendation and the documentation of 30 PPP, that's the one where the choice is to be made. The 30 years of experience is required. We'll work with the board staff to get the language more clarified on that one.
Well, one other just thing, I think the help that you provided here, showing the pages with the changes in and so forth was very, very helpful. One other thing that when we approved this policy, we had a diagram. I remember seeing that. I didn't go back and look. It just kind of had the principal points on it associated with licensure. It was a pretty simple diagram. You know, I think I'd like to have one of those in my shirt pocket or something. You know, there's so many things. A lot of these things need to be in here, but it's so much of this is in the minutiae that really isn't the key piece of the policy.
Okay,
And
we'll find that.
yeah, I think if we could find that updated if we need to, but I think each one of the board members would be useful to have that somewhere in there.
I think we can work directly with your team maybe to make sure that as we get closer to implementing this policy and board members start to get even more questions, that we have some of those things available. So I think there are some that we can resurrect that are a little bit more simplified in terms of communicating the high-level changes in terms of structure and timelines, and even just the websites and the links to your emails.
There is a good 2-pager now that is an overview of the entire policy, so that might be another good thing to make sure everybody can.
Good. Okay.
All right.
Paul?
Great. So on the leader side, we have 3 revisions for you for the current leader policy that we want to walk through briefly, involving a couple different pieces of the actual current policy. One is around the leader licensure policy for out-of-state candidates. And the current policy passed from 2009 currently states that you need to have 3 years of leadership experience if you are out of state. And now this is to streamline. This is in accordance to 2 things. One, the licensure rule that was passed last summer, and also to streamline that, and as well as the current legislation to allow for out-of-state candidates who, in kind of 2 simple steps. So they complete an out-of-state program, leader licensure program, 1. 2, they have 3 years of educational experience, not necessarily leadership experience. So 3 years of teaching experience most commonly. And then 3, as you see, they would make that application to us. If they had already passed the leader praxis, the SLLA, they would be issued our beginning license. And this is that way to now broaden the pool, but still have those kind of tight quality controls around like the praxis tests for those candidates coming from out of state. If they have not taken and passed yet the leader praxis, then they would be issued the A license, which would allow for them to be an assistant principal coming in, and then as soon as they had taken and passed the SSLA, then they would have that conversion would happen to the beginning license. So it's trying to really be in accordance and alignment to the rule that was passed over a year ago as well, and also for making, I think, realistic changes now that we've all heard and talked about since the passage from 2009 of the policy, for really being proactive with candidates, but still keeping those quality controls in check. So that's the first piece. The other 2 are also necessary. One is now for leader evaluation. It no longer needs to live in the leader policy because we now have a teacher and leader evaluation policy that is separate. So it's simply to strike that and remove it from the current leader policy, because it's now embedded in our teacher and leader evaluation policy. And then also with professional development, because that now lives in part with our revised TIL standards that were passed and that you approved in April of 2013 for 2 levels. One for professional learning standards that were passed by the state board in 2011, and then also our teacher leader standards, the national model teacher leader standards that were also passed by the board in 2012. Both of those sets of professional development standards now live in the revised TILs that were passed in 2013. So it's kind of unnecessary or redundant, and also the evolution of professional development, especially for leaders, is now reflected in the professional learning standards that are there, and that's why they both would show up in the revised TILs. So on the leader policy side, those are the attempt for streamlining on the first piece, and then also for the second to reduce with that. We'll take any questions before I'm going to turn it back over, I think, to Amy for a final piece on licensure, and then we'll keep moving.
Just a technical question. So in this section that we have, everything that's underlined is new. Is that correct?
Everything what?
If it has an underline, it's new.
Yes.
Okay. And if it strikes through, it's gone. Right. Right. Yeah. And if it's just bold or whatever it says, right?
This is really encouraging. We've gone from 50 pages to 29 pages.
Exactly.
That's amazing. If we can go from 29 to 15, now we'd be.
We could have a pocket. You put something in there.
This is great, and I thought maybe just for the benefit of the members, you and I and members of your team have had a number of discussions, I know, about sort of the additional steps we can take to look at both leader licensure and leader preparation policies. I know that's an interest of a lot of our board members to think about school leadership. I spent some time this morning in a couple of schools very close to where we are right now who have incredible school leaders, and the impact of a school leader is, one of the most important factors as we think about improvement. So can you talk to us a little bit about what our next steps are to look at leader licensure and leader preparation where we are?
Yes, thank you for, it's a reminder. Yes, especially now because, when this current policy was written, we did not have a strong, robust leader evaluation system in place, which we do now. And so there's going to be a real effort and attempt to say, how do we streamline licensure and continuing along efforts today with program approval, with leader prep program approval, and have an opportunity to do that in a very comprehensive way through stakeholder engagement with our 20 leader prep programs, with the board, with our superintendents, with our supervisors, with our principals, about really trying to have a licensure policy that reflects the instructional leadership needs that are here, and those needs, both licensure on the front end, evaluation on the back end, that's more specific, are both reflected in our leader prep programs, both with alignment, with preparation, with the course sequencing, and also some of those outcome measures on the leader prep side that are reflected in our leader standards, the revised TILs, and then also reflected in evaluation as well. So trying to make that even more seamless, and we're going to be very intentional about, you'll hear, and Amy might mention this, for the implementation working groups on the teacher preparation policy side, that we want to do something very similar with leader preparation and leader licensure, to have that similar kind of stakeholder engagement process so we can really tighten and streamline and make sure that's all in alignment.
So there'll be more changes coming back.
Yeah.
This one change we agreed needed to be made immediately in terms of allowing out-of-state candidates an easier path to entry to principal licensure in Tennessee, but we know there are additional things that are going to need more stakeholder engagement before they come back to the board. So we'll have more conversations.
Right. And that could be as early as July. We'll bring in some of those ideas and drafts to the board.
Okay.
Great. I'm going to turn it back to Amy for our final licensure piece.
So I just wanted to come quickly today and give you a little bit of an update on educator preparation policy work that we've been doing. You'll recall that in October, the new educator preparation policy was passed on second reading. And as a significant part of that policy, we have convened an implementation working group, and we just wanted to take a moment to report back to you on that work. Since October, 36 individuals have been selected for the implementation working group. We had an application process that was driven by the way that the National Accrediting Agency, CAPE, the Council for Accreditation of Educator Preparation, select their reviewers, and we had approximately 100 people start the process or indicate that they were interested in being a part of this work, and ultimately we selected 36 members. We were very excited about the composition that selection presented. As you can see on the table, We have stakeholders that are quite diverse and represent our state geographically, but also represent our key stakeholders really well. We have 11 stakeholders from our K-12 sector, and so we're very excited about that. And in terms of our preparation faculty who are participating, we have a very nice representation from the different types of institutions that we have training educators in Tennessee. The purpose of this group will be to advise the department on implementation on things including procedures, tools, metrics, and benchmarks. But in addition to that, we are asking that they communicate with their communities, and we've been really excited about how seriously they are taking that. After our first meeting, we had members of this group email us and say, can you please send us that PowerPoint as quickly as possible? I need to share it with the faculty that work in the preparation programs near where I work. And so we're really excited about how this process appears to be turning out. So the last thing I wanted to show was simply what you can expect to see from us related to this work. So as I mentioned, we have convened the implementation working group. We've held our first meeting in person. Dr. McQueen joined us. That was great. And we are getting ready to hold our second meeting, which will be virtual, and it'll be our subgroup meetings. And then in June, we will have our second in-person meeting. And then we anticipate to meet again before the October board meeting. And so at that meeting, we plan to bring you a progress report, not just on the work that the implementation working group has done, but in general related to the new preparation policy. And then over the next year, we'll continue to develop all the procedures and processes related to implementation of the new educator preparation policy, and full implementation will take place in the fall of 2016. So just wanted to let you know that that work is on track. And if you have any questions?
Questions? Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Good job. Okay. Sarah, you up? Okay. Okay.
Stand up here. I don't have slides, but you'll be able to hear and see me a little bit better. I'm excited about the work that Amy's team is leading on the teacher preparation front, and I think one thing that we'll be definitely interested in, Amy, is sort of the first iteration of these annual reports. They're going to be looking much more specifically at outcome measures, and as a board, we'll want to think about how that works in tandem with the report that we currently put out in conjunction with THEC. I think there's some opportunity to really think strategically about how the data that we're generating on our teacher prep programs is shared with various stakeholders in a way that's a little bit more coherent across potentially multiple reports. So an opportunity for additional collaboration, I think, with the department on that. Look forward to that. I have two things I wanted to update you on. The first is around the standards review work, which I know many of you, we've talked a lot about this, but just a chance to give you kind of a very current update. We've talked a lot as a board about our role and our work, and that it really starts with listening and learning from our educators and letting that drive the decisions that we make as a board. You all have done that repeatedly over the years. Most specifically, one instance that I can think of is around evaluation, where we were listening and learning and adjusting our policies based on what we heard. And this standards review process is an additional opportunity to exercise that approach to really listening and learning from our educators around, in this case, our math and ELA standards. It's a very timely sort of opportunity in that we've been implementing these new standards in the state for 4 years now. And at the governor's charge, we're now conducting a very public review process of those math and ELA standards, which, as you know, are what our students in K-12 are to know and be able to do in math and language arts in each grade. So really those instructional standards. And what have we learned over the last 4 years about what works with our current standards and what do we need to change so that we can come out on the other end of this review process with really high standards for our students and very clear expectations for our teachers about what they need to know and be able to do across these grade and subject areas. So just a brief update on where we are with that process. We have been working closely with the governor's team, the board members and staff, as well as with the department.
to coordinate this effort. We have a public website that to date has been our primary vehicle for collecting input on the standards, and that is tn.gov/standards review. Pleased to tell you that as we get to the conclusion of that public input period, and the website will stay open through the end of the month, so the end of April when that website will be closed, but we have nearly 118,000 comments and suggestions about the specific standards, the math and the LA standards, from over 2,700 individuals across the state. So again, 118,000 comments on the standards from almost 3,000 individuals, which is significant input. I think that represents a whole swath of stakeholders, primarily educators, a lot of parents, community members, and it's really important information that will this summer come back to, and you have a visual. I probably should have put this on a slide, but members have this visual in terms of how this information will then be passed along to our educator review and development committees this summer for some really significant work to take that input as well as their own expertise and experience and really come out on the other end with Tennessee-specific standards that will come to the board next April upon first reading. But as we move through that process, I'll be coming back and reporting to the board both in individual phone calls and at our meetings like this about that work. We expect it to be a very busy summer. These review committees are going to be coming together for the first time in person in June in Nashville to do some really heavy lifting around the initial review of the comments from the public website and beginning to put those comments to work in terms of the changes that we'll want to make to our standards. And we've really been able to get some really phenomenal educators to be part of this work. So when you look to see who's on our math and ELA committees, it's some of our best educators across the state representing all areas of the state. K through 12 and higher ed representatives as well. We're partnering with SREB, the Southern Regional Education Board, in this effort. It's, as you can imagine, a pretty heavy lift, so it's definitely a team effort. And they're supporting us in a number of ways. They have someone on contract who's going to be assisting with the development of the templates and the way that we share this public comment with the educators this summer. There's a lot of cleaning of the data and sort of reporting it in a way that's usable. And then we'll also be sharing it publicly so that all of the comments, everything that we're seeing come through the website will be shared with the public and available as the educators are doing their work this summer. At the conclusion of the summer, we'll have a draft set of standards that, again, will be ensuring that we have additional stakeholder and face-to-face opportunities as well as an additional online opportunity to provide input. And that'll happen over the course of the fall and winter, prior to, again, the board's first reading of the new standards in April 2016. Second reading would be in July of 2016. And I'll stop there and take questions. I want to make sure specifically, too, to meet with each of you and let you know the educators from your various communities that are serving on these committees this summer, because they are tremendous educators that are going to be doing some really important work, and we're excited about it, but also acknowledging that it's going to be a heavy lift this summer. It's going to be busy. But I'll stop there and take questions if you have them.
Any questions? Yeah, Wendy?
Other than the website, is there any other method for public comment that will then filter through the process?
So over the fall and the winter, that's where we'll be having additional opportunity to get feedback on sort of the draft standards. Right now, the primary way is through the website, and you can go in and look at each of the standards individually, and you have various options. You can say, keep it, no change, review it, move it, and when you say review it, you can either make a suggestion about how to change the language of the standard or where it should appear instead in terms of if you think it should appear in a different grade, and then remove it, and you're forced to make a comment. If you say review or remove it, then you have sort of a comment piece there. So that's the primary way right now to collect input, but then over the course of the fall and winter, once we've taken all the website comments, educator committees have done their work, then we'll have additional sort of engagement with public and stakeholders.
Sarah, can we expect that you will utilize the tracking mechanism so that everyone can clearly see the changes that are being embedded into the former standards? So
yes, we'll make very, we expect substantive changes, and as we look at the comments that are coming in, for example, and I'm going to give you an update on some other work that we're leading around high school math in just a minute, but for example, when we look at the Algebra 2 piece of the review on the website, there's a lot of comments about things that we want to look at. So I think we'll have to think about the best way. I think just giving a tracked change version is not going to be the best way because it's going to be pretty significant in terms of how we think about the coherence of the new standards. But
But we'll make sure that as we all collectively, and I'm looking at Dr. McLean and others, are presenting that information back after the summer committees do their work, that it's clear, sort of what has occurred in terms of the changes.
The algebra 2 appear to be the most, problematic, most commented on.
It's certainly one of the areas that we're seeing the most comments. Secondary math in general had a lot of comments, and I think we know that that's going to be an area where we talked actually just yesterday with the lead of the math committee, John Prince, who's the superintendent in McNairy County, about that fact, and they're going to have a lot of work to do, I think, to look at those math standards and the pathways for math particularly.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. Here, next item.
Okay, and again, this is sort of a natural transition from that conversation. We talked in January at your last meeting about the idea of a pilot and a work group around high school math, particularly with an eye towards industry connections. And so the board sort of gave permission for a working group to come together to really begin to explore what are the connections between high school math and industry? What do we need to look at in terms of both how our current standards are structured and the way that they're taught in terms of application to industry? We had the first meeting with this work group on May 23rd, and you can see you've got the workshop agenda item in front of you. We really tried to invite representatives from industry from across the state, as well as educators who we knew had an interest in really exploring connections between high school math and industry. And I know this is something that, again, many of our board members have expressed real interest in terms of making secondary math relevant and applicable to the workforce and the ways that it needs to be applied in our industries across the state. So on the 23rd, we had a really long and productive discussion. Tess was there with me, and we facilitated the conversation with this working group. We talked a lot about the many and deep challenges that we face as a state in terms of math instruction. And so there were three things that came out of that sort of lengthy discussion that day in terms of next steps. Primarily acknowledging that there's no silver bullet here when it comes to sort of preparing students to be ready to take on the math that's required in the real world in industry, that we really have to start early in terms of making sure students are mastering the foundations of math concepts, and that if we're waiting until high school, that's often too late. And so we need to think, again, more holistically, I think, about math instruction as a state. But specifically when it comes to making secondary math more relevant, the first thing that the work group proposed is that for the 15-16 school year, a limited number of schools in Hawkins County and Greenville City schools are going to teach the current Algebra 2 standards in a more applied and sort of industry-specific way. So the standards would remain the same, but the way that they would approach teaching those standards in those schools would rely much more heavily on partnerships with industry and thinking about the applications of those standards and a more applied instructional technique. And the students participating in those courses and the more instructionally or applied instruction would take the Algebra 2 end of course exam, which is still required for graduation, the ACT, as well as the work keys assessment, which is often one of the assessments that's used to understand readiness for industry. And that we'd look at the results of those three assessments to evaluate the sort of more applied teaching techniques of our current standards. We also said at the end of the discussion on the 23rd that the work group, or representatives from the work group, would meet to make some recommendations to the standards committees this summer. So those educators that I was just referencing are going to be taking a long, hard look at our math standards and how we're thinking about math pathways. And that, again, this working group would like those educators to really think about application and industry connections as they're doing that really deep work this summer to revise our math standards. Because what we didn't want, and this was the conversation on the 23rd as well, is to get too far ahead in setting new courses in motion before the work this summer takes place, where we're kind of stripping it all back and looking at math standards and making some changes. So the third thing that we agreed to do as a working group was that after the standards review committee meets this summer and make their changes to the math standards, that this working group would come back together to revisit the idea of potentially a fourth-year course that could be developed that would be more of a bridge into industry, and think about that fourth-year math as an opportunity potentially where there may be a gap that exists that we could, as a state, consider an additional math course. And I know David Williams and Tammy Shelton are both here who've been really critical parts of those conversations in terms of what gaps we might currently have in our math offerings. But again, trying to be intentional about the sequencing and not to get out too far ahead of the work that's going to happen this summer, where I think we'll have some, as a state, real aha moments about sort of, our math pathways and where we might have gaps, and wait to the conclusion of that summer session before we would make those determinations. So I'll be giving you another update at the October meeting about where some of that lands, but I'm happy to take any questions or defer them to my math colleagues in the department.
Any questions? Sarah, you mentioned perhaps changes to the fourth course. So we anticipate at this point that there allows to be some tracking or changes to the third year course, also, and I'm talking about Algebra 2, that I guess, at least to me, it seems to be clear that if the students are not going on to kind of STEM program in college, that what we currently have in Algebra 2 and what we will likely still have after we make these changes is more than is needed, or not what is needed if they're going into something other than STEM. Is that?
Yeah, we've had a number of these discussions, and I may tag out to some of my friends in the room who are a little more knowledgeable in the deep kind of math science, if you will, behind the standards. But in the conversations that we've had, and certainly with higher ed, and Candace, you can speak to this too, I know, Algebra 2 still seems like sort of the standard benchmark that we want all students to master before they kind of make a determination about which path they would go. That's still the credit-bearing course that's required for entry into our post-secondary, whether it's TCAT or a four-year institution. Our colleagues in higher ed still feel very committed to that as a standard, though I think we all acknowledge that Algebra 2 standards themselves need to be revised, and so that's what's going to happen this summer, is to look and see, are they currently conceived of in the right way, or do we need to make some changes to the third-year course standards? But, Candace, what am I missing there?
No, I'm happy to address that. So I've met with the UT system, Katie High, and I've also met with TBR on a variety of issues, but the Algebra 2 question came up, and what I was told from both is that Algebra 2 would still be an admission entry standard for them, whether it's TCAT or, a 2-year, 4-year additional program. So they were very adamant that Algebra 2 is a requirement for entry into the post-secondary program, whichever one we're talking about. So we are trying to work with them. If there were any changes in the Algebra 2 standard, would it still meet the requirements that they have at post-secondary?
Okay. Other questions? We passed this on first reading. I think that what we did pass last time on first reading, we could have had on second reading. Now, we're still within what we passed on first. We aren't changing anything that I see. Is that correct? I'm getting questions about how come we passed it on first reading, we don't have it on second reading.
So we debated whether it should be a workshop update or an item, but because we're not changing the standards for 15-16, and we made the decision with the board support that, again, the standards review process this summer needs to take place before we would actually change standards even for a pilot course. Teaching the current standards differently didn't require actually board formal action. That's something that's allowable under current policy. So it didn't make sense to bring an item for second reading that didn't really require the force of a policy change or policy decision. I do think when we revisit this at the end of the summer, if there is the desire to create a fourth-year course that looks different from anything that we currently offer, then that's where the second reading of sort of the commissioning of that pilot work would continue. But at this point, this is just an update because after first reading, the work group met, determined that for the next year, the standards would stay the same, and then we would revisit the need to create potentially a new course after the summer.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, I had one other one, but I forgot what it was.
You know how to get me.
Lady. I'll think about it and we'll address it later. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, sir. Okay.
It's our final item. And we are excited to bring, this is our year 3 evaluation report. So we do this every year. When we say year 3, this is around the 13-14 school year last year. We had yesterday, the commissioner and I, a good session with the media about this report. And wanted to touch on a couple highlights because we brought a few of these to you back in January on the first 2 pieces. And so, and the commissioner had touched on one of those earlier today. So we'll kind of just show you the latter part, and then you have the report in front of you as well for questions and those pieces. But I think two interesting pieces, and we touched upon this yesterday with the media. The big theme about now that the year 3 and now in year 4, moving from this emphasis on scoring that happened in year 1 and a lot of concerns and very understandable concerns from teachers and from principals. I know in year 1 I was still a high school principal, spent a lot of time with teachers talking about how do we move from scoring to continuous improvement, really showing how evaluation is one tool to do that and moving towards continuous improvement. But that's a process. We know that's a very long process and an important process to help teachers and principals understand that movement. So that was a piece I think we're seeing more and more evidence through survey data that teachers are understanding and recognizing the value in feedback on evaluation results for changing practice. Because again, we know we can do all of this, and if we're not getting to the heart of changing practices in the classroom, it's not effective. And so teachers getting more differentiated feedback based in part on evaluation results really can help with the right support from the district and support from the state. So that's one big theme, and the other one I wanted to echo, which shows up on this slide, was the annual feedback that we get from teachers, from telesurveys, from a lot of different aspects to make changes to the evaluation rubric and model. So, for example, after year 1, the recognition that schools that were significantly struggling needed more support with the team coaches. We have 8 regional team coaches that work specifically with schools that are struggling with misalignment between growth scores and observation scores. The other thing that was heard loud and clear was reducing the value of the growth score measure from 35 down to 25% after year 1 for non-tested subject teachers. So that's, I think, important to note and to be flexible about. Second was after the second year, both about hearing that there need to be more rigor in the certification exam for evaluators. So that was done, increasing the number of team coaches to help struggling schools across the state. And then also tweaking the rubric in the instruction domain to really reflect the changing nature of standards and academic standards that were being rolled out in Tennessee. So all those were done in response to educator feedback as well. So the report you have in front of you has kind of 5 big major areas, and these first 2 that I mentioned have either been talked a little bit today already by the commissioner on student achievement results, and then the second one we had talked about in January briefly. So we'll go through those quickly and then get to the other 3 as well. But both these next 3 slides have already been shown and talked about over the last 4 years, certainly with TCAP growth in grades 3 through 8 from 2010 until now, certainly within the high school level as well, recognizing that we do have an opportunity and a real important mandate to try to move the needle and help, especially at the high school level for the post-secondary piece. I think I keep coming back to that slide of the $9,000 and those students that are not going on to get a credential or are working full-time after high school, what that means and what it means for our teachers and what it means for our leaders and the importance of that piece and the role that evaluation can play in that. And then also with the ACT average, as we've talked about. So I think there is an important connection, but and that's certainly fleshed out in the report as well. We also saw just kind of an overall implementation from a couple really, I think, pieces we've seen actually throughout the last 4 years. One, it's been consistent that almost 75% of our teachers, our tested subject teachers, are moving students either a year or more's worth of growth. So those are the teachers that have a 3, 4, or 5 in value added. That's significant, right? Since the beginning of the evaluation system, the new one in 2010, that we have almost 3/4 of our teachers are moving the academic growth needle for students across the state. And I think that needs to always be reminded and credited to our teachers and to our principals that are helping to make that happen as well. We're also seeing an increase in the number of teachers that are receiving individual growth scores. We're now just under half, so about 48% of all teachers have that, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. Also touch upon the team coaches and their efforts and the effectiveness they've done. So this was the piece we talked about in January, both for the 3 years spread and seeing basically stronger alignment between observation and growth, especially on the high end. So for example, level 5 teachers, this chart's a little, could be a little confusing, but at the bottom, as we've talked about before, was the year 1, and there was about a 16-point difference between level 5 teachers that received a level 5 on growth and their observation score. And then if you go up to the top in 2013, 14, or year 3, that's down to about 3.5%. So a greater confidence in evaluators being more accurate in their scoring, and then also that alignment and misalignment being reduced, especially on the high end as well. And that's also interesting on the principal side, because last year was the first year we had 10 districts that were in our pilot for the principal evaluation rubric. And we also saw in those 10 districts, which is on the top half here, a greater distribution of observation scores than in the non-pilot districts. This is the first year now for the revised rubric to be statewide on the principal side, and we're seeing, again, a pretty healthy distribution of scores, even though we're still not yet at the end of the year for that. But this was, again, reflecting last year on the pilot side of 10 districts compared to the non-pilot as well. And what that leads to is some themes that we also saw in the report that you have in front of you. These 4 themes showed up not just certainly in the report, but as we're grappling with and working through over the last 4 years. It's one is overwhelming desire to maintain the stability of the current observation rubric and not to tweak or tinker with that too much in terms of the content. Second, ongoing concerns about the time required for the observation process. And that's also, as we're going to talk about, flexibility options that districts have at their current disposal in order to both do more informal observations and decrease the number of observations for higher performing teachers. Legislation was passed last year for correcting the confusion on the 15% measure so that it's in the hands of the teacher making the final decision. And then also this notion, as we talked about, feedback. How do we continue to help teachers and principals get better and more specific feedback going through their year to change practices? And we're seeing a lot of really interesting, innovative examples of that. We're seeing that on the principal side with districts using more than one evaluator to do site visits, to go into schools under kind of the adage of 2 heads are better than 1 when you go into school to give feedback. We're certainly seeing that on the teacher side as well, of having multiple observers is an example of one practice with that. Feedback, this was just one way to show that extensive feedback collection around evaluation, both through the annual TEL survey, the annual 10 credit survey, in-person meetings. We have a state email address for team questions that answered over 4,000 emails last year. Also had the teacher ambassador position, which is really exciting. That's going to continue into next year as well, for designing the teacher council to really make sure the teacher voice is heard, not just through the council, but it's one mechanism. And then also for developing some ways to unpack and understand, like TVOS, for example, as you see on there as well. So I think the feedback part is a real piece that we will continue and has been part of the evaluation process as well. Very quickly on the support tools, and this is where the team coaches have come in, but they've done phenomenal work over 2 years. These coaches work specifically with schools that have had misalignment and have helped reduce the misalignment and have helped principals get more accurate in their scoring. You see that middle bullet of nearly 80% of the schools have reduced misalignment by more than 10 percentage points. And that's an ongoing process that it's helpful. And I know being a former principal, needing time and energy and effort and expertise to think about giving better feedback to teachers. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. So that's also highlighted in that part of the team coaches that operate across the state out of our regional districts. With flexibility, these are kind of the 5 big areas that where we've focused on flexibility around evaluation. With alternate models, there are currently 4 teacher alternate models that have been approved through the state board along with team. We'll highlight a couple observation practices that go along with flexibility that districts engage with. Optional growth measures and portfolios that also districts have the opportunity to use. The student perception surveys, and then the growth override. So all of those are kind of bundled under what we call flexibility under evaluation. To give you a couple quick examples, right now we have 19 districts that are using alternate models based on last year. Numerous districts using some of the flexible observation practices. Some districts using the portfolio growth models like the fine arts portfolio, like the PE portfolio, or the world languages portfolio for their growth for teachers and non-tested subjects. Student perception surveys. So just trying to give you a snapshot of what that looks like with flexibility around evaluation. And to do that in kind of a quick piece of that, what does that look like? That can mean co-observations. It can be multiple observers. We're seeing some really interesting work with teacher leaders around this last bullet, where teacher leaders are able, not always even giving formal or official evaluation feedback, but non-scored kind of ongoing feedback to their peers in a way that puts them in a coach role and not in with the evaluation hat on it as well. And that's a way that districts are recognizing that evaluation feedback has to live in multiple ways. Right? They can't just be that one person always, that one evaluator like a principal, but it can be in these multiple ways to give feedback, both for the teachers and on the principal evaluation side as well. So districts are really there are multiple opportunities to do that, and I think that's another powerful way, because I think all this is geared towards feedback. All this is geared towards how do we help teachers and principals get better feedback for changing practices that are showing up in the evaluation model. And then just to wrap up on the local flexibility, some of the models that are available, and as I mentioned for the fine arts, I think now has grown over the last 3 years. We actually are closer to 17 districts that are utilizing the fine arts model for teacher design, teacher scored, and teacher led for the arts teachers that can use that as an example. And those are going to, I think those will grow, especially on the K-2 side. There's a lot of demand in districts, especially for first and second grade, for that portfolio assessment model as well. So I know I went through that very quickly, but it was to try to give some of the highlights that are in that year 3 evaluation report. I think that maybe, yeah, that was the last piece. So trying to be conscious of time, but wanted to make sure there were time for questions as well on year 3 evaluation report. I think it's, the point, it is a little lengthy, but it's I think maybe 35, 36 pages, so we're sorry for the length. But.
And appreciate getting the report too yesterday, so that's helpful. Questions for Paul? Yes, Wendy.
I have one. Sorry. And you have a section on in development, and the only one I didn't understand was the alternative educators part. Can you tell us what you have in development around that?
Yeah, that's similar in terms of a portfolio model that would be used for like an alternative schools that are. We've had good conversations about developing models that could be more applicable for teachers that are in those environments.
So you mean like discipline kids who are in school? Okay,
right.
That's it. When I heard alternative educators, I thought alternative pathways. I was trying to figure it out, right?
Yeah, great question.
I appreciate all involving so many folks for this process. I just think that's tremendous, very helpful to us all go in the same direction.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think it's great. It's a good report, and I guess I'm encouraged by the, I think, increasing acceptance of the process and appreciation for the value of the process. Continue to hear that, and hope that continues.
Like I said, I know these reports, because I've been on the creating side of them, are not easy and take time, and I think it's remarkable, and I think it's really important in the state that we continue to do this. I know I hear all from other states who are really looking to learn around what we're doing on evaluation, and while it takes us more time to put together a report like this, in some ways I think it's most beneficial to states that are watching and trying to implement, at slightly earlier stages in the work, what we're learning, and I think it just demonstrates again that we're being transparent, that we are committed to continuous improvement, and that we're sharing that very publicly about what we're learning, what we're changing. So.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. In fact, this morning I had 4 different states interested in this recent release. So I think we sometimes forget, and not that that we're ahead of the game, but that, to your point, Sarah, making it transparent and trying to really focus on continuous improvement. It serves as a role, is a model for other states that are either maybe in year 1 or year 2, and they do look to Tennessee in terms of figuring out, multiple measures, a lot of the pieces that are here. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Very good. Okay, we're approaching the finish line on this marathon. So we want to take a break here before we get into anybody take a break or not. We can move forward with the agenda item. Okay, good. Okay, next item is Angie will talk about fish.
We covered that this morning. We changed
Okay.
the year 3 report was our last official.
Okay. On the, just kind of getting back to the board meeting policy thing, I think we need to rework what we have said there in first and second reading, more in line with what we were talking about this morning. Do we need to, what's your thinking about whether we ought to go ahead and have it on the agenda and then work on it before next time, or?
So that was my initial thought, was that we would approve what we currently have on first reading, because we're making some additional changes regarding what is appropriate for consent. And then on final reading, we can bring the changes that we talked about earlier in our planning session, as well as I've gotten some feedback from additional members, Lonnie and Lillian both gave me some feedback on some other sections of that policy that we could tweak. So if it's okay with you all, I thought maybe we approve it on first reading with regard to that new language on just regarding what goes on consent, and then we'll make some additional changes before final reading.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Everybody, yeah, comfortable with that, but I think there are some things. Okay, other questions on the agenda that Wendy?
Actually, we've made a change full time for tomorrow.
That was my question, if we wanted to say what we were pulling.
Yeah, and I'm going to defer back to Angie and Joanna. So just to update the board, the calls that we're having one-on-one, to make sure you've had a chance to ask questions and go deeper on some of these items. The licensure actions, the revocation and the formal reprimands and other actions that we take based on misconduct, in this transition period, where we now have not helping to lead the review committee, we're looking at the precedent that we've set before, and in some cases, we need to go back and revisit some of these. So in this case, there were a few that had been reviewed by the previous review committee, and when we took another look, we weren't quite comfortable moving forward with the recommendations, so we're pulling those, and I'll let Angie and Joanne speak to that specifics.
I'd like to know, are you actually talking about the items under 6?
Yeah.
6, yeah.
Yeah, there's a few that we're going to pull, but you're not taking
down
into
item
review.
3C right now.
Yeah. No, this is the licensure action that's the back of the binder. Angie and Joanna, if you want to walk us through the ones that we were recommending that we pull for future.
We are going to pull H through J this time, and hold them for the future. So H, I, and J.
So Murdoch, Pierce, and Self.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just, so I think it's probably going to have a conversation tomorrow, right, Sarah, but just so the rest of the board, the staff has been great I've had concerns around this every board meeting, so it's not a surprise that I've had real concerns around some of these, and the staff has been really responsive to me. But I do think these are going to take a little bit of time tomorrow to just walk through concerns and policy around restoration of licenses and decisions on stuff. So that's where the pulling of those three came from. But
again, I appreciate your flagging of these, Wendy, and I think we didn't get to that point this morning, but one thing we thought about that I think we should come back to the board is whether or not we want to have a board member sit in on these board meetings. You know, we bring you the recommendations, and I'm learning this too now for the first time as I get into this role. But we need to really examine, I think, the precedent that as the board we're setting in terms of actions that we take, and in some cases if we determine that we're not comfortable with what the forward precedent was, then we need to make that determination together. And I do think it would be helpful to have representation, and do probably one member who would rotate or be participating in those meetings, but something we come back to in a first teacher planning conversation. Because I don't want it to ever feel like it's coming to you and you wish you had more time to think about it. Really, things are pretty nuanced, and we could use, I think, a board member's perspective as we're making the recommendation.
Okay. While we're on these, any other questions on the license action? Yeah, I've got one too. That thing I had with yeah. And I guess maybe not getting into all the nitty gritty, but recommendation from the Attorney General that we do the restoration. That's understanding.
Sure. So because his attorney has filed the appeal in Chancery Court, the Attorney General's office is our counsel in this case. And so because of the likelihood that there may be an appeal, if you all vote tomorrow to not restore his license, I can't really get into the weeds of the merits of the case, but I will say that the Attorney General's office did review this case with us, and their recommendation was that we proceed with the restoration.
that's one of the ones I want to
And we left it on there for that reason.
Right. So the argument that his counsel is making is that his license was revoked on the basis of this felony conviction, and because the conviction has been expunged, there's no longer a conviction, so there's no longer grounds for revocation. Some background on what the argument is.
I think definitely tomorrow, but folks might have some discussion.
Right.
I've done it. We're going to take this tomorrow.
Okay. Do we need to pull that one off then as far as have separate discussion on that one?
We have to get roll call and all, right?
Well, I mean, what we've done in the past is that one we have discussion, we pulled it off.
Yeah.
Get that discussion include the others in mass.
There are a few that I need to have to well, and L is another restoration. What's the restoration? You want me to tell you which one that bothers you that about?
Okay.
I'm happy to. And I'm not trying to be difficult, but I do feel like these are like, this is one of the most important things to do to impact it. And so I want to take it seriously. I think we need to separately discuss Cunningham. Oh, I'm sorry, wait, that was a permanent revocation, correct?
Right.
Mr. Haynes is one we were just discussing.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have holes, so. Mr. Marlowe. That was also on the piece of letter.
And I'm happy to sell them to our reasoning.
Yeah,
See if you guys are tomorrow think that that would be helpful.
Right. This initial.
Yeah, that one is also a recognition.
Permanent recognition.
Right. So the ones that you had flagged for me were Marlowe, Snyder, and Thompson.
And Moody.
That's a revocation.
That not any city.
Yeah. So the complete list is Haynes, Marlowe, Snyder, and Thompson. And then we removed 3 of the other ones that you had.
Can we have some general discussion today rather than wait for the close tomorrow?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm looking to the chairman. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I don't know why we're waiting till tomorrow. We just can't make a decision.
and I don't know. I'm happy to share sort of where I came at this with the staff and where my concerns were with them. If that's how you want money, if that's what you're looking for, or
I'd least like to hear your thoughts on
okay.
some of those.
Okay. So my thoughts are, first of all,
Where are you going to start? Which one?
I can start general.
Yeah.
I was just going to start sort of like my general approach to these. And I asked, and the staff has been great, and this is not any sort of judgment on anything that they have done. I think they're following what the policy is, and I want to understand the policy better because I think it may be a policy problem. But where I'm coming at these from is I'm a defense lawyer by heart, and so presumption of innocence, people make mistakes, people are never as bad as their worst mistake is my philosophy on life. However, I think that the teaching profession is a profession and a privilege, and these people are with children, often alone with a group of children, and I feel like this is different than whether liberty should be taken in a criminal proceeding, and that we need to, our first responsibility is to these children, and our second responsibility is to the profession, and that we don't let the profession be demeaned by having lower than appropriate standards for who is in front of these children. So that's where I came at it, and so I looked at each of these, and I asked a lot of questions, and I'm not asking the staff to go, I asked a lot of the detailed questions, and I'm happy that Haynes is the first one on here. I'm happy to address that one if that's how we want to do this. This was the statutory rape conviction, which was a felony, but it was under a statute I'm very familiar with from my former life, which is a conditional plea, so you're not admitting guilt. Under 4035, 313, you are pleading guilty. If you complete the conditions of the probation, the conviction is expunged, and you are allowed to stay under oath, except for limited circumstances, that you were never convicted of a crime. So I get where the AG is coming from. He pled to statutory rape. He completed his probation. He got it removed from his record. However, I don't think it removes the fact that there is an allegation of sexual intercourse with a student. And for me, I'm not even reading into it whether he pled because he was scared he'd get a worse sentence, or I don't even care why he pled. I'm ignoring the fact that he pled. I'm concerned about the fact that there was an allegation of statutory rape that led to a criminal charge by a police department and a district attorney's office that investigated that case. And his license was revoked by agreement, I believe, and I would like the standard to be for someone to get their license back, we need to know that either this didn't happen or that some other reassurance that children in a classroom, that he would not make similarly bad choices around children in a classroom. And that's why the AG says for technical reasons, you might lose on appeal. I get that. can be a good lawyer, but I'm not willing to put my name on a document that says that this man should have a teaching license again in the state. That's where I am on the state.
I agree. Well, my question is, this was changing. Whichever one was, if the girl said that her mother, can you flag them?
Let's forego that and just get back to this one. The consequences of not following what the Attorney General says here is that you might lose on appeal. Is that
right? So if this does go to Chancery Court and they decide against us, then that will set our precedent for future cases that any time we have an individual who has a felony conviction expunged, that we will need to restore their license. And so that's sort of the risk that we take in allowing it to go to Chancery, is that do we want Chancery Court to set our precedent, or do we want to look at each case individually and set our own precedent? But I'll reiterate that this recommendation is on the advice of counsel, and that ultimately it is completely at your discretion whether to move forward with collaboration.
Oh, okay. All right.
okay?
So, we got a case that's coming back to us, and the AG is saying, give the license back because it's been expunged. Don't go to Chancery Court, because if we lose, then we will have to take cases that are expunged. So either way, we're being told to take them if they've been expunged. We're either taking them so the court doesn't tell us we have to take them, or we're taking them to avoid having the court tell us.
I understand what you're saying. I think that we have additional flexibility to look at each case on an individual basis moving forward if we're deciding this for ourselves, whereas if we have a judgment from an appeals court saying that we have to do it, then we are bound by that absolutely.
But Chancery's not an appeals court. Could we not?
This is not appeals court.
This is why.
Say it would be their appeal, and I get that. My position on that is that I'm trying not to wear a lawyer hat here to apply your shoes, but an opinion by the Chancery Court would likely rest on the facts of a particular case, and not. It may be that Chancery could say anytime something is expunged, you have to restore a license. The likelihood of that, I would think, would be less than, usually they try to restrict their opinion to the specific facts of the case. So I'm willing to run that risk, actually, because it's less of a risk, in my opinion, than me saying, yes, he can go back to classroom. So, and I'm only one board member, and, that's my feeling about it.
Okay.
All we're really saying is that it's ultimately up to you all to make the judgment call of whether or not you want to go with what the Attorney General has advised, or go with what you feel is right. Had this been a different situation, it would be a different situation if the Attorney General and all that wasn't involved. So, we were just making a recommendation based on advice of counsel, and then
you have to make a decision. That's why we're not telling you. I think this is one where there's not a good path forward, and I think it's a hard. I think I would just encourage you to vote.
I understand that, because I thought I kind of understood. Chancery appeals to Court of Appeals until Supreme Court.
I think under the lawyers can only, but for teacher licensure issues, if we deny it, the teacher could go to Chief 3 to appeal us.
But then we could appeal a Chancery ruling if we wish to the State Court of Appeals.
I don't know if it's under the.
And it only becomes a record if it's State Court of Appeals.
I'm sorry, what?
It only becomes a case of record if it's ruled on by the State Court of Appeals. but it wouldn't be,
persuasive.
There may or may not be an opinion, but any lawyer, I guess, in Davidson, if it's the Davidson County, I forget what county it's in, but the Chancery Court in whatever county, yeah. So it would be statewide applications if we appeal it to the Court of Appeals and then lost again or one. I mean, it really just depends. But there would be that precedent out there, generally.
If the AG, yeah, and I'm not.
Okay, we'll handle that one separately, and everybody votes the way they feel so inclined. Okay?
I've always been very uncomfortable with this idea that restoration allowed the person, no matter what had happened, if they were approved for restoration, they really didn't have to do much. They didn't have to do anything. It was automatically restored, rather than have to go through a process where they would have to reapply, getting us certain evidence that they had done. Is that right?
No, I don't think so.
He would have to reapply
Yeah.
if he was restored.
He has applied for restoration.
He has applied for restoration. So that's what
This is how this is pending.
Okay.
Right, which also distinguishes from suspension. So if someone is suspended for a 2-year period of time, their license is automatically reinstated at the end of that, and they don't need to prove anything to us unless there's some contingency. Whereas with revocation, they need to go through the process of applying for revocation and show us that the cause of the revocation no longer exists, and that what they have been doing in the interim, right. So there's the criteria listed in our restoration policy, and we're making some changes to that restoration policy on first reading. Actually,
Yeah, I want to talk about that too.
yes, to clarify the difference between restoration after suspension and restoration after revocation, because they are two different kind of paths.
And before you talking about the policy on it, I asked the staff, and they were clear that if he is restored, he goes into a classroom, my child is in that classroom, unless I know enough to go look at the disciplinary records online and read his disciplinary records, which wouldn't probably tell me too much. I don't know what to tell me. I would have no idea that my child's teacher had sex with a student. And, again, I'm not a Scarlet Letter fan, but I have, I try to analyze these, would it be acceptable for this person to be my child's teacher? And so, that may be a policy situation we need to look at, too, on just,
right.
How you deal with that. Because you want to be fair, because I know some people are charged with things that don't, there's no basis to them, and you don't want to have them, their career start. But I want to err on the side of safety.
Right. And the restoration policy does make it clear that it is completely at your discretion. There are no guarantees that anyone is going to be granted restoration. And so, we're simply presenting you with a recommendation, but of course, as well as the vote of your conscience.
So if this is completely within our discretion, which means it doesn't have to be subjective to whatever we say, what was the fourth rule?
No basis.
But it's in our discretion.
I think they're meaning that their recommendation we're not bound by. That's what she's saying. Not that.
Oh, I got it.
We just to continue, so I think 2 things for sure we need to do. So as we discussed before in our training session, there's areas that we want to go deeper in and get educated on as staff and as board members. I think this falls into that category, and we need to revisit the policy. And then I really do think having one of you sit in on these review committee discussions about all of these papers would be enormously helpful for everyone. So then we come to the discussion with a little bit more of a board member's insight as well as the staff recommendation. I would like that cover, that kind of collaborative approach to figure it. These are tricky cases.
Okay, can we move to Marlo?
I don't know if anybody else wants to. Okay.
Can we move to Marlo?
Before we move, we'll rotate.
Before we move, can I ask for clarification? Because if we're going to vote on these tomorrow, we're thinking about changing so that we can sit in after the revision to the policy. I'm not going to feel comfortable voting on this one or any other that's in the same vein, statutory rape or some other misconduct with the students, pictures, photos, inappropriate. Do we have to vote on this law?
That's my question. Is it up or down? Is it a deferral? Is it a request for more information? Or is it strictly up or down?
Well, Kyle, to counsel. I mean, we pulled the ones that we thought we could pull that seemed to really warrant additional discussion. I think the one with Amy's recommendation is sort of its own unique sort of animal. Well, there's sometimes considerations, but we never have to vote on any. I mean, we could pull them. Bottom line. Right. So you can always dispense with our recommendation and send it back to us. So everyone votes that we don't want to move forward with the suspension. I'll just use K for an example. If you all vote that you don't want to move forward with a 1-year suspension on that one, you don't think it's severe enough, it will come back to us as a review committee, and then in order to preserve that individual's due process rights, we will have to send out a new notification of a proposed action that is something more severe, and then bring that recommendation to you again at the next meeting, if that makes sense. So basically, if you all vote to dissent, it'll come back to us, and we'll bring you a new recommendation.
What I'm kind of like Lydian, saying with all the questions being raised here about all these, whether it would be just to pull all these off the agenda tomorrow and come back to the next meeting with revised recommendations, if there are revised recommendations.
I think that there are a few on here that we would all feel comfortable moving forward with. I would say that A and B and F and G and M are ones that the review committee felt very solid about moving forward with. D as well. And so I think that any of the ones that we feel solid on, we should move forward just because we have to remember that these individuals want to get back to work and want their licenses either unflagged or they want a decision made regardless. Right. And so I think if we can move forward with some of them, that would be.
Okay, let's A, B, D. What was the other?
F, G, and N.
M or N?
M and N.
I did flag E, but not as I am not voting for this, but as one I think we as a board needed to discuss.
Once we just went through with the ones, I think we would say we could comfortably move forward.
Has anybody got any?
We would hold off on.
Some of these we may be comfortable moving. I mean, and I firmly agree that if we can move forward, either to deny or to uphold what you guys are recommending, it's in everybody's best interest so that everybody can have some finality. But so some of these, I mean, and I'm fine with holding off if we need to on some, but some if you want me to go to Marlo, just explain why I flagged it, because I don't know how I would vote on it. I just wanted to express the concern. This is the one where there was inappropriate contact with a student, and then she recants last year. The agreement was that he could apply to restore his license after 3 years, and so it seems clear, and maybe the staff who has more knowledge than about the fact that they at least have this inappropriate text relationship, so whether they had any physical contact is what's been recanted, right? Right. So the revocation was based on two things: this accusation of inappropriate.
Now, which one are we talking about?
Marlo.
What number?
That is D.
And the extensive text messages. So without the allegations, all we have left is extensive text messages. And in previous cases where we've had licenses revoked for inappropriate communications, we have granted the restoration application after 3 years. And so this one, regardless of whether or not the student recanted, the recommendation would still be the same if we're going to keep in line with precedent. Does that clarify our reasoning?
It just seems to me with the kind of the questions that have been raised here about this, that the ones that any of them that we have questions about, we just ought to pull off the agenda, go back and kind of reinforce the recommendation. So let's leave A, B, D, F, G, and M on the agenda and remove the rest. That's
Can I make one note on L? I know that there were some questions on that one as well. That's a restoration application. So the revocation order is from 2011, and it explicitly states that we were going to revoke his license until the terms of his sentence are complete. And so since he sent us proof of that, you know, if we had it up to do all over again, maybe we wouldn't include that language in the order. But since that's what the order states, I don't know that I would come up with a different conclusion.
This was
I think it'd be hard to come up with a different conclusion on L.
And this was the reason I flagged this. This is an attempted possession of cocaine. Even attempted possession of cocaine is different in various circumstances. But my only reasoning for flagging this one for discussion was that precedent of agreeing on a drug case. Again, I don't know what the facts were. That it would basically automatically come back upon completion. So it was just a concern about that precedent having been set and where we need to be, what we need to be doing as a board, as a department, in like where our heads are on these cases. So I think with his situation, it's done. You're right, and we should, I would agree with honor what has been promised.
But you're right to flag it, because I don't think that you just articulated. I think that would absolutely be something we would not want to do in the future in terms of including that language.
Yeah, and I think in some of these, on the Marlowe one, if we want to say that it's permanent revocation as opposed to revoking for 3 years, I think maybe moving forward, we can be more intentional about what the orders state and what the terms of the revocation are.
Okay? We'll leave A, B, D, F, G, L, and M on and remove the rest. Okay? Everybody comfortable with that? Okay, other questions on the agenda for tomorrow?
Okay, let's go back then to 3C, license restoration ruling policy. And what I'm understanding is that, there's some changes to the phrase. Would you all just discuss this?
Sure. So, in dealing with license restoration, Joanna and I had extensive conversations around how the restoration process has been done in the past, and we came to the conclusion that there was some disparity between how they've been handled because the language in the rule and the policy is not clear. And we decided that the best thing would be to revise the rule and policy to give the clarity that we think is required, as well as reflect the clarity that's in the suspension policy. So our policy on suspension and revocation and all that is much more detailed than this restoration policy. And then in reading it some more, once I really dug into the policy, it became pretty clear that there were some definite things that need to be cleared up. For example, previously, restoration after suspension and restoration after a denial or revocation were lumped together, and going back to what you were saying, that created some confusion as to whether or not it would be automatically reinstated or not. So we decided those need to be pulled out separately, and it needs to be clarified. So the first, if you look at the policy, the first paragraph says specifically restoration after suspension of license. And it talks about what happens if your license will be restored after the period has suspended, but if we put some additional terms on your suspension, like sometimes it'll say, if it was involving alcohol, you're suspended for 2 years and you have to show completion of an alcohol abuse class or something like that. We want to see proof that you did that, not only that you served your suspension, but that you completed that class. So that is the suspension pathway. The restoration after denial or revocation
all we really did in that portion is just clarify exactly what happened. So there was some confusion about whether or not after denial or revocation, if when they apply for restoration, it goes to the board as a whole, or whether or not they have the ability to request a hearing before an ALJ, and in the exact same way that if it's a suspension. So if we propose to suspend your license, then you get a letter notifying you that you have the right to, the recommendation is to suspend, you have the right to appeal, you have 30 days to let us know if you want to appeal, and if you notify us of that, then it goes to an ALJ. And it never actually comes before the board, because the ALJ sits in the place of the board and makes a decision whether or not they agree with the recommendation that's been made. That wasn't clear in the restoration policy, because in the rule, which you'll see on the first page, it said that application for such issuance or restoration shall be made to the Office of Educator Licensing and shall be voted on at a regularly scheduled meeting of the State Board of Education. And so that language was confusing in that it made it seem like every single time somebody applied for restoration, it had to be voted on by the board, which isn't necessarily true if they request a hearing. If they don't request a hearing, then it's voted on by you all. Like in the Marlowe case, he didn't request a hearing, and so that is why it's before you all.
So then, am I correct then, if in one of those situations, they make the new language, leaves application for such issuance or restoration shall be made to the Office of Educator Licensing.
Mm-hmm. That's how it's currently done.
Right. But that doesn't mean that they are deciding. They have to send that on to the court for the administrative appeal or to you.
They send it to Joanne.
And it's Joanne. See, right now it looks like it's not coming at all to the board.
Well, the rule just says it goes to the Office of Educator Licensing, but they are the ones, and the policy makes it more clear that they receive the application and then they forward it to us, and then we make a recommendation based off that. That's how.
Okay. Do we need to change the rule too, or is the rule sufficient and then just clarify the policy?
So where in the new policy? The new policy she checked here, rules. Guidelines.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's, okay, where on that sheet is the stated after the Office of Educator License, yes, that's what they do.
I think, well, it says in the new language when an application for restoration is received.
Towards the bottom of the first page.
On the bottom of the first page, we could clarify it from the Office of Teacher Licensing.
I think it does.
It doesn't say in here at all that it goes to the Office of Teacher Licensing.
I think, actually, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the issue was that the rule is sort of misleading and that makes it seem like the Office of Teaching Licensing is the deciding body, and it's not. And so the clarification in the policy was just trying to make it clear that it's actually, so but I think maybe it's making it a little more confusing by not including anything about licensing, but the fact is that it kind of routes through the Office of Teaching Licensing. So if anything, yeah, maybe
We could identify that because, one of our teachers who was Thursday today asked me before the meeting, does this mean that the board's not going to be voting on things that they're going to go to the department now? The department decide?
Yeah, I mean, the way it normally is, yeah, the way that it's in it's the same way in our suspension policy, because the same thing happens when somebody applies for a license or they've been reported by a director for some kind of conduct. All of that's reported to the Office of Teacher Licensing. They flag it, and then Joanna gets it, and then we start our process. So I can make a change in the last paragraph on the first page of this and just say when an application for restoration is received by the Office of Teacher Licensing and it's forwarded to board council, something like that to make it clear that it's going from them to us.
And I see what you mean too, Carolyn. Sorry, I was missing that. But in terms of taking out the sort of confusing language in the rule, in some ways it's a little bit more confusion in the, because I think Andy's point. So there are some cases the board doesn't vote on, so they go to court because they've been called for a hearing. Yeah.
And I understand that. I think that generally, though, we want to make it, we want more of the detail and clarity to be in the policy rather than living in a rule, because it's so much harder to change a rule than it is to change a policy. So I'd rather make that clarification in policy than in rule.
So do we want to add something to the rule or not?
But we're already changing the rule, because we're deleting part of it.
Yep.
Yeah. We could put,
That's all we're doing. I mean,
we could do, if you wanted to make additional changes to the rule, we could say that application for such issuance or restoration shall be made to the Office of Educator Licensing and forwarded toward the council. Something like that. I just don't want to provide too much detail about the process in the rule because it's a lot harder to change.
I understand that, but I think if we can,
Yeah, that,
in there.
something like that, I think
that would do it.
Okay.
Okay, let's get somebody to look at that wording and do that.
Right, and provide it to us in the
Yeah. Carolyn, get you to make that addition. Okay? Other questions?
I have a question that I actually posed to Angie, and that was on section 3H. We talk about the board meeting and have outlined the development of the agenda towards the bottom, and we talk about the process of adding unscheduled items, and I suggested and questioned if we don't want to also add what about the deleted items. I know that you as chairman have the opportunity at the beginning of the board meeting to come up with recommendations.
And we actually vote on it.
Yes.
Should
Should it be documented?
There's nothing that speaks to when you take something off. So that just,
It's not here. It's not referenced.
I'm just adding new items. So some of the language after speaking with Julian, I think it's a great idea. We want to include more detail in policy. I was thinking about adding some language that says something like prior to or at the time of the meeting, because a lot of times we do remove items during the workshop and not actually at the meeting. An item may be removed from the agenda with the permission of the chairman.
Okay, but we include that in the consent vote when we approve the agenda. Identify what's going to be removed before we vote on the agenda.
Okay, so
So it's actually approved by the board.
and include it as an item. I can play with the wording, but.
Okay, I think on this one, on the board meeting policy, I think we've got a good bit of rework we need to do on it. I guess what I was suggesting was go ahead and approve it on first reading, but realize that we've got a good bit of a number of suggestions here that we need to rework.
Yes, this policy has not been updated since 2005. So it's basically 10 years old. A lot of people didn't even know that we had this policy.
I'm not sure I did.
Yeah. So there's definitely a lot of changes that need to be made. And I think we had this conversation earlier, just so that everybody knows, our thought was to approve the initial changes with regard to what's included on consent on first reading, and then on second reading, I will come back to you with some of these additions for final reading.
And then on section 3, page 4 of 5, 8A, the last sentence. I had to read that several times, and I found it confusing, and I did point that out to Angie. And Angie, I don't remember your suggested change, but that there could be some clarity to if ruling at a regular meeting or prior to the agenda item, if ruling at a special call meeting, that was confusing.
Yeah, and I totally agree. The reason I think that language is included in there is just that normally the findings and recommendations of the executive director, when we're deciding on a charter school appeal, is at a regular call meeting, we would discuss the findings and recommendations of the workshop, and then at the meeting, it would just be the vote. And so I think whenever this language was written around a special call meeting, because there's not that prior workshop, they didn't really know exactly what to do. So my recommendation to Lillian was that we just put or prior to the vote on the agenda item is ruling at a special call meeting to make it clear that there is going to be time at the special call meeting for discussion of the executive director's report prior to the vote on the recommendation. I think that's what it was trying to get at. This is also, this policy's been around for about 4 years, so it's definitely part of the reason we're bringing it back is there needs to be some changes. So I think that that's a good change as well.
Okay. Other questions?
And I missed this one, but on page 2 of 5, I did ask Andy also to clarify the reduction in section 4 of 10 business days to 5 days, and I suspected I knew the answer, and I did, but I want her to share with everyone why that reduction is occurring, because I think it's important for others to understand.
And I'll let Ted take that. She can provide you with more background.
So the changes around this section specifically, and there were some other changes on page 1 that specifically deal with the analysis of the argument of substantial negative fiscal impact. That an LEA is allowed to deny a charter school application based upon the substantial negative fiscal impact argument. And so when we were really digging into what would this analysis look like if an appeal comes to us with this reason for denial, we realized that in our policy we were giving districts 10 business days to return requested documentation. And when we think about the fact that the board only has 60 calendar days from receipt of notice of appeal to vote on a charter school appeal, that in essence was meaning that we were losing about 14 days. So 2 weeks in that 60-day time frame. And that to us was really cutting into the ability of the staff and our external review team to do a very thorough analysis of a fiscal impact argument. So we did want to cut this down significantly in order to also say from a district perspective, if you are going to deny based on substantial negative fiscal impact, that not only is the LEA's burden to prove, but that we will be requiring documentation, and it's going to be on a very quick basis because we have our own analysis to do. So that was the reasoning behind this change.
We'll communicate. I think all of this will be communicated. We're meeting tomorrow.
Yes, we actually, Angie and I and Sarah are heading directly from our meeting to the meeting of the Tennessee Association of Charter School Authorizers, in which I'm presenting our appeal policy, but also discussing these changes so that they know very much ahead of time that if a denial is coming to us around fiscal impact, that they need to be ready to go.
Okay. Other questions?
I've always had trouble with this fiscal impact, because when you look at a government budget, including a school's budget, it really doesn't tell you what your costs are. It doesn't tell you what the revenues are fairly easy, but you've got line items over there of how you spend. It doesn't tell you what your fiscal impact is going to be. You're really getting into cost accounting, and so how do we really judge if there's going to be a adverse negative impact based on a government budget model?
So,
This is a long
We're going to separate you.
So this is something that Tess and I have been working extensively on. We are still trying to answer that question. Prior to the state board having the responsibility to assess
substantial negative fiscal impact on appeal. The treasurer's office was tasked with that wonderful task. And so we do have about 3 years of treasurer's opinions that we can at least look to see how the treasurer went about trying to make that determination. But at the same time, we want to look at what could we do differently. Our standard of review is a little bit different than what the treasurer's standard of review was. At our taxa meeting, we are going to have an extensive discussion with a lot of the key players at the table about what are some things you think we could take into account that maybe the treasurer didn't? What are some things you think the treasurer got right? And so we're really going to try to engage stakeholders in helping us try to develop our criteria around evaluating substantial negative fiscal impact, while at the same time living within our charge in the statute, which basically says that we have to look at this on a school-by-school basis, and we have to assess it within our standard review, which is whether or not it's in the best interest of the students and the community and all that. So we are working to try and tackle this fair analysis, and we are obviously welcome any input you all might have on what type of criteria we should look at, because we really do think, and I will.
Required criteria, right?
And, well, actually, that was removed.
It was removed.
So,
But it's in our policy.
we put that in our policy. But yes, there was a lot more extensive things when it was rested with the treasurer, but when it moved to the state board, that entire part was removed from statute. I mean, the thing is that, when we actually had a conversation with NACSA about this topic, they did say that we as a state are very much on the forefront of this discussion and really think this is something that's happening nationwide, and also for us to have it in statute and something that's in our policy is very much on the forefront. So we are digging deeply in terms of what could we potentially bring to you all that's reasonable and that really looks at all the data, but we would welcome conversations if you have thoughts around this as well.
We're in the forefront, we just don't know how to do it.
Yeah, there is Memphis case law, right, that may be around the treasurer's analysis, but there's case law out of Memphis on the fiscal impact stuff.
Yeah, it's really how you're defining fiscal impact. I mean, the way a government's going to look at it's going to be a lot different than the way an operating company's going to look at it. And if we're talking about a fiscal impact on a specific site, a school site, there's so much overhead that is blended throughout all of the systems that they don't charge against that one side. I think that if we're not careful, it's going to be greatly flawed, and we would be misleading people to say there is or there is not fiscal impact.
The standard is significant fiscal impact such that it's not in the best interest of the students, community, and school.
Yeah, so it's on a district-wide. We're required to look at it on a district-wide basis. So it's not that the district can say, we're going to deny this charter school because it's going to have a substantial negative fiscal impact on a school within our district. It's that it's going to have a substantial negative fiscal impact on the district as a whole, in that what Wendy was saying, such that it is not in the best interest of the community and the people of the district. So we have kind of at least somewhat defined arena to play in. We've got some treasurer's opinions to look back at. The treasurer never found substantial negative fiscal impact. So,
but doesn't it also kind of really reduce the opportunities of our poorer and smaller districts to ever have a charter option?
If they deny it, are you saying if they deny it based on
fiscal impact on that kind of county and or district, it's going to be greater than it would be in Metro Nation.
Yes.
Well, and so far, I've never found negative impact.
And they
don't have it in the small county.
Well, the only
I know they have an extra one.
they had one from Blount County. They had one from Blount County, was one of the treasurer's opinions was Memphis, Shelby, Jackson, Madison, and Blount County. So that's the smallest district that was analyzed, and even in that case, the treasurer's office did not find substantial negative fiscal impact there.
In my memory of that Memphis case, because in my other hat, we were looking at which school we were in October. The ruling involved the district having an obligation to try to minimize the impact. I mean, there's a lot of that.
That's exactly what the Memphis case was about.
Right.
And what's going to elevate this, even though it doesn't come before us, the whole discussion on vouchers is going to elevate this even more. Yeah. Because look at what funding bodies are saying in the counties now. If you allow us to have to deal with this with vouchers and charter, will the funding body and all of a sudden look at the financial impact? And Mike, you think we don't have, believe me, county commissions have no idea how to deal with that. When they have no idea how to even get into that.
But that also argues we're really getting into that. But if a charter has a fiscal negative impact, significant, whatever the phony language is, why is that not arbitrary? Because the county commission can fund whatever level, whether there is a charter application in front of it or not.
Well, I can tell you from a former life working with the Senate, with the
Seems like everybody's got a former life, right?
Yeah, we've been around. But I'll tell you, this language was intentional. That first of all, that it should be, each school ought to be dealt with in the singular. So that if 25 came, you would have to look at one each in the singular, specifically to make it more difficult to make a point.
Okay.
So
I got one more question. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. This thing has been handled in the past, and this I just think by the treasurer. Why would the controller not have a role, comptroller?
So the treasurer did contract with the comptroller's office to assist them in the data analysis. So the comptroller did have somewhat of a role. They didn't make the decision, but they at least helped in the collection and the analysis of this physical data that they got.
And then the data was simply sent to the treasurer's office, and the treasurers then looked at that data along with all other information that they gathered.
Can they work for us?
We have uncertainty that they've got a great list.
But I do want to throw this out, again, back to our planning discussion. I mean, there are several things that emerge, I think, as areas that we want to go deeper into board or probably sooner than later. We've now talked about charter authorizing and starting our day visiting charter schools. I think we got to think about when and how to make sure, some of us that haven't been trained for next are going up to get trained, but even those of you that have been trained, these issues are going to continue and probably increase in sort of the scope and nature of what we are asked to decide as a board. So we should think about how we want to continue to get smarter on all of this before we have to make decisions and call. BEP, we haven't talked a whole lot about, probably because there's a whole lot we still need to understand and know. That's on my list of things to continue to get educated about, and I think probably another area we need to go deeply. And then the licensure revocation issue, in addition to all the policy things that we know, teacher prep and otherwise. But we'll be doing some extensive follow-up on today's discussion so that we can start to clarify and set the timeline for these topics that we really need to go more deeply into, so we make sure that we set ourselves up to make good decisions when these topics come back up. This is, I'm so impressed that we're coming up at 4 o'clock in this level of detail.
We like these marathons.
I'm sure you're throwing me under the bus. I'm willing to be the fall guy.
One other quick question on Cambridge, isn't it? Don't we need to have a roll call vote for that?
That's a rules change, I believe, of the department. What item number is that? AF.
Yeah.
Or AF. Yes, because it was approved on first reading last time. time, so this would be a final reading rule change that would require
Roll call. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Mike, Wendy?
I lost number one.
Okay.
I'm sure I'm glad we discussed those revocations here instead of waiting for tomorrow.
Yeah.
I know you wanted to have Dr. Trout and coffee.
Dr. Trout, because I think it's cooking. I did not say yes.
Yeah.
No, I
You
wouldn't
use
do
that
that.
differently, everybody.
Julie, I have a comment.
Okay.
I just want to say, like, thank you to Sarah and team. Like, you guys have just dug in and are pushing us, and we need it. I mean, we want it, and I want it. And, like, the amount of work that you put into this is obvious, and the amount of work you guys do every day, so I just want you to know.
Well, we're just getting started. Once legislative session's over, get ready.
Okay, tonight, 5:30 pickup or what before
Well,
that?
I mean, at this point, we're at 4 o'clock, so that means I'm going to take you all to the hotel. I'm going to stay there, and then we'll
Okay. And then, we're still doing that photo in the morning, 8:45 in the, legislative, in room 12. 8:45.
We can make comments for dinner, but if anybody runs into parking or driving themselves in the morning, we may be able to park near the farmer's market and shuttle up if it becomes an issue within our area. I don't know whether cars would be created as usual parking, but we'll cross our fingers.